The transmission came in at 3:47 in the morning, station time, and it carried no sender ID. I was not supposed to be awake. I was not supposed to be in the communication hub at all. My shift had ended 6 hours earlier, and the only reason I was still sitting in that cold, dimly lit room was because I had nowhere better to be. Ambassador duties on a council station are mostly waiting. Waiting for meetings, waiting for votes, waiting for species who measure time in centuries to make decisions that should take minutes. I had gotten good at filling the silence. That night, I was doing what I usually did when the station slept, running passive scans on open frequencies, listening to the galaxy breathe. My name is Kale Varos. I served the Galactic Council as a liaison between species, the kind of diplomat nobody notices until something goes wrong. I was Thireni, which meant I had 4 eyes, 2 of which could see into the infrared spectrum, and a reputation for being calm under pressure. The calm part was genuine. The pressure, up until that night, had always been manageable. The transmission was encrypted in a council cipher that should not have been accessible on an open channel. It was not addressed to me. It was not addressed to anyone at my level. The header indicated it was a restricted communication between the Vorkai Dominion's High Command and the Council's Executive Chamber, the Inner Circle, the 12 species who made decisions that the other 400 only heard about after the fact. I should have flagged it and walked away. I did not walk away. The cipher was a variant of a standard Council encryption package, and I had spent 11 years working in Council communications. I knew the architecture. It took me 4 minutes to open it, and every second of those 4 minutes felt like standing on ice that was just beginning to crack. What I read changed everything I thought I knew about the galaxy I worked in. The document was a contract. Formal, detailed, legally constructed in the exact style the Council used for military operations they wanted kept far from any public record. The Vorkai Dominion, 70 warships, the most feared military force in the known galaxy, undefeated across 6 separate planetary campaigns, had been commissioned. The target was designated by coordinates rather than name, which was the Council's way of keeping a paper trail that could be misread on purpose. But I knew those coordinates. I had filed travel advisories for them twice in the past year. The target was Earth, the humans. I sat very still for a long moment. The station hummed around me. Somewhere down the corridor, a cooling system cycled on and off. I read the document 3 more times, because I wanted to be wrong. I was not wrong. The reasoning was laid out in clean, administrative language. Earth had been under passive observation for several decades. The species was assessed as pre-contact. No confirmed faster-than-light capability. No organized interstellar communication. No awareness of the Council's existence. However, the observation reports flagged a pattern that had made certain Council members uncomfortable. Human technological development was not linear. It was exponential. The rate of advancement in propulsion, computing, materials science, and energy production had been accelerating in a way that the Council's analysts described as statistically anomalous. The projection was simple. If Earth was left alone for another 40 years, humanity would achieve independent faster-than-light travel and make contact with the broader galaxy on their own terms. A species that violent by nature, the document cited centuries of human conflict as evidence. Arriving at the galactic stage, without having been properly introduced or brought under Council oversight, was classified as an unacceptable risk. The solution was removal. Not negotiation, not contact, not the careful, generations-long introduction process that the Council's own charter mandated for emerging civilizations. Removal. The Vorkai would handle it. Their record was clean, efficient, and guaranteed. 6 species had faced them. None had survived the campaign intact. The Council had plausible separation. They had not technically ordered anything. They had simply approved a contract with language vague enough to survive any future review board. My hands were not shaking. I was surprised by that. I was Thireni. We processed shock slowly, which was usually considered a weakness. In that moment, it felt like a gift. I thought about the implications for approximately 90 seconds. The fleet was already moving. The contract was time-stamped 4 days ago. At standard Vorkai travel speed, they had already covered a significant portion of the distance to Earth's solar system. There was no official channel I could use to stop them. The order had come from inside the executive chamber. Any protest I filed would be buried. Any communication I tried to route through official channels would be intercepted by the same people who had approved the contract. There was one thing I could do. One entirely unofficial, career-ending, possibly charge-worthy thing. I could warn them. I found the emergency contact protocol for Earth. It existed, barely, as a theoretical contingency file that some optimistic council communications officer had set up decades ago in case of accidental contact scenarios. It was a radio frequency, a basic mathematical sequence, and a general-purpose translation scaffold. It had never been used. I was fairly certain it had never been tested. I composed the shortest message I could manage. Coordinates of the incoming fleet. The timestamp of when I estimated they would arrive. A single line of context. Fleet of 70 warships approaching your system. Their intent is hostile. I am sorry. I sent it. Then I sat back and waited, with the absolute certainty that no reply would come in time. Earth was too far. Their technology was too limited. Even if they received the message, even if they could decode it, even if they believed it, what could they possibly do? Against 70 Vorkai dreadnoughts, against a force that had ended civilizations. I gave myself an hour before I would have to decide what to do next. Whether to keep quiet and pretend I had never seen the transmission, or whether to walk down the corridor to the executive chamber and say something that would end my career and probably my freedom. The reply came in 1 hour and 53 minutes. I nearly fell out of my chair. It was brief. The translation scaffold handled it smoothly, and the words were perfectly clear. No panic in the language, no confusion, no questions about who I was or how I had gotten their frequency. Just a sentence that was so calm it made the hair on my secondary appendages stand straight up. We saw them coming 3 days ago. We have been waiting. Thank you for the confirmation. I read it 4 times. Then I read it a 5th time. 3 days ago. The fleet had left Vorkai space approximately 4 days ago, which meant that within 24 hours of the fleet's departure, before I had even found the transmission, before anyone at my level was aware of what the executive chamber had approved, Earth had already detected a fleet moving through deep space toward their solar system, a pre-contact civilization. A species that the Council's own intelligence assessments had categorized as early spacefaring, limited to their home system, no long-range detection capability. They had seen a fleet coming from light years away, before the fleet had even cleared Vorkai home territory. I sat in the communication hub for a very long time after that. I did not file a report. I did not go to the executive chamber. I did not contact anyone. I just thought about what it meant that the Council's intelligence on Earth was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not outdated by a decade wrong. Wrong in a way that suggested Earth had been doing something very deliberate and very careful for a very long time. They had known the Council existed. They had kept quiet. They had built whatever it was they had built, the detection array, the systems capable of seeing a fleet in deep space, and they had said nothing. I thought about what kind of species does that. I thought about a civilization that spends decades watching a galaxy it has not introduced itself to, quietly building capabilities, never announcing itself, never reaching out, just watching and preparing. And then I thought about the fleet heading toward them, and I thought, those people have no idea what they are walking into. I pulled up every piece of open record information the Council had on humanity. Science reports, atmospheric studies, historical observation logs. I had read some of them before in passing. Earth came up occasionally in routine Council briefings as an example of a developing world, nothing more. I read them with different eyes now. The history was what stopped me cold. Humanity had a recorded history of organized conflict stretching back thousands of years. Not occasional skirmishes between neighboring groups. Not territorial disputes that flared and faded. Continuous, generational, systematic conflict on a scale that no other pre-contact species in Council records came close to matching. They had developed weapons with enough force to destroy their entire biosphere, and then somehow, through some combination of fear and negotiation and sheer exhausted stubbornness, decided not to use them on each other. They had survived themselves. I had never thought about it that way before, but sitting in that room reading their history, it was the only thing that mattered. Every other species the Council had ever encountered as a pre-contact civilization had a history of conflict that, at some point, was resolved. by one group achieving dominance, by exhaustion, by the natural limits of primitive technology. Humanity had spent millennia trying to resolve it, and never quite managing to, which meant they had spent millennia in a state of constant preparation for the worst possible scenario, generation after generation, building and refining the skills and systems and thinking required to fight and survive and fight again. They had not been shaped by peace. They had been shaped by everything that tried to stop them and failed. I looked at the coordinates of the incoming fleet. I looked at the timestamp on Earth's reply. I thought about 70 Vorkai dreadnoughts sailing toward a world that had been quietly, patiently, invisibly getting ready for something like this for longer than anyone knew. I reached a decision. I was not going to sit quietly and hope for the best. I was not going to go to the executive chamber and protest, because that would achieve nothing except getting me detained. Instead, I was going to watch very carefully, document everything, and be ready to speak when speaking became possible. I started drafting notes in a private file that existed on no council server. I wrote down everything I knew, the contract, the coordinates, the fleet composition, the timeline, Earth's reply, every detail. And then I started a second file, because there was a question I kept coming back to that I could not answer from any of the official council records. The question was simple. If Earth had known about the council for an unknown number of years, and had spent that time watching quietly and building capabilities without announcing themselves, then the thing they had built, whatever had let them see a fleet departing from light years away, was not the only thing they had built. You do not spend decades preparing for something and build only one tool. The fleet was 70 ships. It had defeated 6 civilizations. The Vorkai were the best military force the galaxy had produced in living memory. And somewhere out in that solar system, circling a blue-green world that the Council had categorized as not yet relevant, a species that had survived itself for 50,000 years was waiting. I closed my files. I turned off the lights in the communication hub. I walked to my quarters and I lay down, and I did not sleep. And I watched the ceiling, and I thought about the word waiting. Not panic, not running, not crying out for help or scrambling to negotiate. Waiting. Like they already knew what was coming, and they had already decided what to do about it, and all they needed now was for the other side to show up. 70 ships, I thought. Then I thought, I wonder if that is going to be enough. Then I stopped myself, because that was a thought that did not make sense for a pre-contact civilization facing the galaxy's most powerful military force. Except that it did make sense. That was the part that kept me awake all night. It made complete and total sense. The station's artificial dawn cycle began at 0600. I watched the corridor lights shift from amber to white through the gap under my door. I had not closed my eyes. That was not unusual for me. Thereni sleep in short intervals rather than long stretches. But the reason I had not slept was unusual. I was still thinking about that reply, still turning it over, still finding new edges on it, every time I thought I had understood all of it. We saw them coming 3 days ago. We have been waiting. There was no version of that sentence that was not extraordinary. Even the most generous interpretation, that Earth had built some kind of long-range detection system out of pure coincidence, or that they had gotten lucky, or that they had misidentified something else as a fleet and happened to be right. Even that interpretation meant they had a detection array capable of seeing into deep space at distances no pre-contact species had any business reaching. The less generous interpretation was that Earth had been doing something systematic and deliberate for years, possibly decades, building capabilities while staying quiet, watching a galaxy that thought it was watching them. I got up at 06:15. I washed. I put on my diplomatic uniform, the plain gray that said Junior Liaison to anyone who looked, and I walked to the Council's public archive terminal in the station library, which opened to all staff at 0600 and was usually empty at this hour. I wanted to find out how wrong the Council's intelligence on Earth actually was. The public files were thin. The Council's formal observation records on Earth covered atmospheric composition, basic biology, radio frequency analysis, and early spaceflight telemetry from the period when humans were sending simple rockets beyond their atmosphere. The most recent update was 11 years old. 11 years. For a species the Council had flagged as exponentially accelerating in their development, the most recent intelligence was more than a decade out of date. I thought about that number. 11 years. And I thought about what a species with exponential development could accomplish in 11 years, when nobody was paying attention. Then I found something that had been sitting in the archive, uncategorized, misfiled under a geological survey of a different star system. A passive radio intercept from 8 years ago. It had been logged, tagged as non-threatening ambient transmission, and never analyzed beyond the initial flag. I pulled it up. It was an encrypted signal, military-grade encryption, the analysis note said. But since Earth was pre-contact and theoretically incapable of posing a threat, nobody had ever bothered to actually crack it. The signal had been transmitted from within Earth's solar system, not from Earth's surface, from somewhere in the outer system. The source coordinates put it somewhere between their fourth and fifth planets, in the wide band of space the humans called the asteroid belt. A pre-contact civilization had a military-grade encrypted communication source in their asteroid belt 8 years ago, and the Council had filed it under geological surveys. I closed the terminal. I walked back to my quarters. I sat on the edge of my sleeping surface, and I did something I almost never did. I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I was understanding. The Council had made a catastrophic error, not just the moral error of choosing to remove a civilization rather than contact them. That was a wrong I had processed, and was already carrying. The operational error, the intelligence failure, whatever the executive chamber thought they were sending the Vorkai fleet toward, it was not what was actually there. The Council had spent a decade ignoring Earth's development, assuming that the absence of contact meant the absence of capability. But humanity had not been developing in the open. They had been developing in the dark, and the things they had built in the dark were not the things you built if you thought you were alone in the universe. You build those things when you know you are not. I spent the rest of the morning making a decision about what I was going to do. By noon, I had arrived at the only answer that made sense. I could not stop the fleet. I could not reverse the contract. I could not go to the executive chamber without being removed from my post and possibly detained. But I could document everything, maintain contact with Earth if they were willing, and be ready to speak the truth when the opportunity arrived. I sent a second message to Earth. I identified myself, my full name, my species, my rank, my role. I told them everything I knew about the fleet, the ship classes, the weapons systems the Vorkai were known to use, the standard tactical formations they had employed against other civilizations, the timeline as I best understood it. I did not know if any of it would be useful. I sent it anyway. The reply came faster this time, 40 minutes. It was from someone who identified himself only as Director Callum Hale, Earth Unified Command. The message was short, and the tone of it was something I had never encountered in 11 years of diplomatic correspondence. It was not grateful. It was not relieved. It was not frightened. It was polite, precise, and entirely matter-of-fact, in a way that suggested the person writing it was dealing with a moderately complex logistics problem, rather than the imminent arrival of the galaxy's most dangerous military force. Ambassador Varos, thank you for the detailed information. We have logged all fleet composition data. Most of it confirms what our own analysis had already developed. We are prepared. We would appreciate ongoing communication, and will reciprocate with information sharing as our situation allows. One question: are there any communications restrictions on your end we should be aware of? We do not wish to create difficulties for you. I stared at that last part for a long time. They were asking if my communications were monitored. Not because they were worried about themselves, because they did not want to cause problems for me. A species facing a 70-ship invasion fleet was asking me if they could do anything to make my situation easier. I wrote back and told them that my communications were technically private, but that I was taking a significant professional risk by being in contact with them at all. I told them that I was willing to accept that risk. The next reply came in 20 minutes, and this time it was longer. Director Callum Hale sent me an attachment. When I opened it, I found a document of startling thoroughness, a complete strategic assessment of the incoming fleet, written in a style that was clinical and precise in the way that only long military experience produces. They had identified each ship class. They had estimated weapons ranges and power outputs. They had mapped probable approach vectors. They had noted the specific tactical patterns the Vorkai had used in previous engagements, patterns that, as far as I knew, were not in any public record, and had written analytical notes on how those patterns could be anticipated. At the bottom of the document, a short note from Director Hale. We have studied every available record of Vorkai military engagements, including private council records we obtained through means we will not detail at this time. We understand what we are facing. We are not afraid of it. We want you to know that whatever happens in the next 72 hours, the outcome was not determined by the battle. It was determined long before this fleet ever left their home system. We made our decisions years ago. The fleet is only finding out what those decisions were. I read that note 3 times. Then I understood something that changed the entire shape of what I thought was happening. This was not a defensive emergency for Earth. They had not been surprised. They had not scrambled to respond. They had spent years, possibly decades, in a state of quiet, invisible preparation for exactly this kind of event. The fleet was not catching them off guard. The fleet was walking into something that had already been built, already been tested, already been decided. I thought about the encrypted signal from the asteroid belt 8 years ago. I thought about a species that had the technology to see a fleet departing from light years away. I thought about 70 ships sailing toward a solar system where they believed they were the most dangerous thing in the vicinity. I thought about how very, very wrong they were. And for the first time in that long, sleepless, world-altering day, I felt something that I would not have expected to feel. Not hope exactly, something quieter than hope. The specific feeling of watching events move toward an outcome that is beyond your ability to change, and realizing, against everything your training and experience tells you, that you are not afraid of what that outcome is going to be. I filed no reports that day. I attended no meetings. I sent one last message to Director Callum Hale before the communications window I had calculated would be optimal. It contained everything else I knew: personnel details on the Vorkai High Command, their known behavioral patterns, their documented responses to resistance, their one consistent weakness which every historical analysis agreed on. They had never, in 6 campaigns, faced a target that did not panic in the first engagement. They had built their entire military doctrine on the assumption that panic was universal. Director Hale's reply came back in 12 minutes. Noted. We will keep that in mind. 3 words, after everything I had just sent. 3 words, and in them, absolutely no trace of fear. I went to sleep at last, properly, for the first time in 30 hours, with those 3 words sitting in my head, and the awareness that somewhere in a solar system, the Council had written off as irrelevant, 70 warships were sailing toward their reckoning, and they did not know it yet. Fleet Marshal Dresch had never needed a second engagement to end a campaign. That was not pride speaking. That was the record, and the record did not lie. 6 civilizations, 6 first strikes, 6 sets of final coordinates transmitted back to the Dominion with the campaign marker attached, and then the return journey home, and then the briefings, and then the next assignment. The Vorkai had built a military culture around one foundational truth. The first contact determined everything. Show a species the full weight of what you were, in one moment, before they had time to think or organize or hope, and the rest was logistics. The actual fighting, when there was any, was never more than what you did while you waited for the surrender to be formalized. Dresch stood at the command center of the flagship and watched the transit counter drop toward 0. Around him, his bridge crew worked in the smooth, practiced rhythm of a force that had done this before and expected to do it again. They were good at this. They were the best at this. The Dominion's reputation was built on their record, and their record was built on moments like this: the drop from transit space into a new system, the display of force, the watching of civilizations comprehend what they were facing and choose, correctly, to stop fighting before it got expensive. The transit counter hit 0. The fleet dropped. Stars. A yellow star, closer than expected, blazing on the forward screens. A blue-green planet at the system's 3rd position. Oceans catching the light. White clouds spiraling in visible weather systems. Beautiful, actually, in the way that viable worlds always were. Rich atmosphere. Water. Temperate zones. The kind of world the Dominion flagged for resource designation immediately upon completion of pacification. Standard formation display, Dresch said. His formation officer relayed the command. The 70 ships spread into the pattern that had, in the past, produced visible changes in the communication patterns of targets within minutes. Radar spikes, radio traffic increasing 100-fold as panicked messages bounced back and forth. The specific electromagnetic signature of a civilization that had just understood it was not alone in the universe, and that what had arrived was not friendly. He watched his sensor displays and waited for the panic to begin. 30 seconds. 60 seconds. 2 minutes. The electromagnetic readings from the planet below were steady. No spike. No sudden increase in radio traffic. The planet below him was quiet, in a way that planets were never quiet, when a 70-ship fleet appeared above them without warning. His communications officer turned in his seat. "Marshal, we are receiving a hail on a standard military frequency." Dresh had expected that. Surrenders often came quickly from the leadership of a world, sometimes before the population had even been informed. "Put it through." The voice that came over the channel was female, and it was the voice of someone who had just sat down for a routine meeting. Unhurried. Clear. The translation matrix handled it without difficulty. Whoever had set up that transmission had anticipated the need for cross-species translation and had done so correctly. "This is Admiral Nora Webb, Earth Unified Command. You have entered a restricted system. Your fleet has inadvertently transited into an active military exercise zone. We ask that you hold your current position while we assess any potential interference with ongoing operations. We apologize for the inconvenience and will update you as quickly as possible." Dresh looked at his communications officer. His communications officer looked back at him. "An exercise zone," said his tactical commander, who was standing to Dresh's left. The words came out slowly, the way words do when a person is trying to determine if they have misheard something. "That is what she said," said the communications officer. Dresh felt the particular sensation of a situation that was not behaving according to expectations. He had experienced it once before, early in his career, when a small civilization on a remote world had attempted to bluff their way through a surrender negotiation. That had been mildly interesting for approximately 4 hours before the bluff collapsed. This felt different, and he could not immediately identify why. "Maintain formation," he said. "Advance." He was not going to hold position for a species that didn't know what it was looking at. His forward scouts, 17 fast-class interceptors that served as the fleet's reconnaissance and strike advance, moved ahead of the main formation on his order, spreading in a standard sensor-clearing pattern. For 11 seconds, his sensor board showed all 17 contacts moving in normal formation. Then the board showed 16, then 14, then 9. The disappearances were not like anything in his operational experience. There were no energy readings consistent with weapons fire, no explosions, no debris signatures. The interceptors did not send distress signals or fire warning bursts. They simply went from present to absent, in the space between one sensor sweep and the next, without any of the things that should have accompanied their destruction. His tactical commander was already running analysis. No energy discharge signatures on record. No debris. No hull rupture indicators before signal loss. "Marshal, the contacts did not appear to be destroyed by conventional means." Dresh leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means either our sensors are malfunctioning, or whatever removed those contacts did so in a way we do not have a classification for." The human admiral's voice returned to the channel. It still sounded unhurried. "Fleet Marshal Dresh, yes, we know your name. We'll explain that later. 17 of your forward units have been neutralized. No crew casualties, as far as we can determine from here. The units themselves are not salvageable. We consider that the courtesy warning. We gave you the exercise zone explanation because we wanted to be polite. We are now telling you plainly. You have arrived at Earth. You have done so with hostile intent, and we are aware of the contract your employers accepted. We suggest you think very carefully about your next decision." The bridge was silent. Dresh thought about 6 campaigns. He thought about the pattern of them, the initial display, the panic, the quick resolution. He thought about the fact that in 6 campaigns, no target had ever hailed him first. No target had ever known his name before he announced himself. And no target had ever lost him 17 interceptors in 11 seconds without a single energy reading on his instruments. He was not afraid. Dresh did not become afraid easily, and he had an entire military career's worth of evidence that confidence and preparation beat panic every time. But something at the edge of his thinking was adjusting, recalibrating, running quiet calculations about a situation that was not behaving as situations were supposed to behave. "Identify the weapon system," he told his tactical commander. "We cannot. There is no weapon system on our records that matches what we are observing. The disappearances were localized. Each interceptor went dark individually, in sequence, not simultaneously. That suggests precision targeting at very short intervals, not a wide field effect. But we are detecting no beam, no projectile, no energy pulse." "Stealth delivery system," said his weapons officer. "Possibly. Except that stealth delivery at that range, at those intervals, would require a targeting resolution that exceeds anything in Council military records by a significant margin." Dresch looked at the planet below, blue and white and perfectly calm, enormous and patient beneath his fleet. He thought about the message from the Admiral. 17 ships, no energy readings, no panic. His name, already known. He made a decision that any of his peers would have agreed with. 70 ships against a pre-contact world was not an even engagement, regardless of what surprise weapons they had prepared. The Vorkai had numbers, firepower, range, and 6 campaigns of institutional knowledge. One unusual weapon system and a calm voice on a radio channel did not change the fundamental balance of power. "All ships advance," he said. "Full formation. If they have a weapon that eliminates scouts, we overwhelm it with mass. Standard encirclement pattern." The fleet moved. The planet grew larger on his screens, and for 2 minutes, nothing happened. And Dresch allowed himself to feel the return of something like the familiar confidence. The settled sense that he was doing what he was built to do, and that the outcome was what it had always been. Then his navigation officer said something that Dresch had never heard a navigation officer say in his life. "Marshal, the fleet is not responding to course correction." Dresch turned. "Explain." 18 of our ships are no longer following ordered headings. They are drifting, not in a random pattern, in a directed one. Something is overriding their navigation systems. Marshal, they are moving toward the 5th planet's gravity band. The 5th planet. Dresch pulled up the system display. A gas giant, enormous. The gravitational readings around it were exactly what you would expect from a body of that mass. "Navigation override is impossible," said his systems officer. "Our ships use hardened military control systems. External override requires physical access to the command interface." "And yet," said the navigation officer, with the careful voice of someone who was watching something happen that should not be happening, 18 of our ships are currently on approach vectors to a gas giant's tidal disruption zone, and they are accelerating." Dresch sent the emergency recall signal. He sent it on every frequency. He watched his displays, and he watched the 18 ships continue their approach, steady and unresponsive. The Admiral's voice came back one more time. "You split your formation looking for our scouts. We appreciate that. While your ships were doing that, our systems introduced a navigational correction protocol to the 18 vessels that took the widest arc in your encirclement pattern. They are going to have a very difficult time around our outer planet. We recommend recalling your remaining forces. We are not doing this because we enjoy it." The 18 ships hit the tidal disruption zone. The gravitational shear at the edge of a gas giant's Roche limit is not something any ship is designed to survive. The structural tolerances of even a military vessel have limits, and when those limits are reached by forces that build rather than strike, not an explosion but an increasing, relentless pull in multiple directions simultaneously, the failure mode is not dramatic, it is just an ending. A ship that was there, and then is not. 14 of the 18 were lost. 4 managed to recover some navigational function and pulled away at the edge of the zone, trailing damage. In the space of 9 minutes, Dresch had gone from 70 ships to 39 functional vessels. He stood at his command station, and he was very still, not because he did not know what to do, because he was doing the single most important thing a commander can do in a situation that has gone completely outside the boundaries of expectation. He was thinking, without the distraction of action, about what had actually just happened. No weapons fire, no head-on engagement, no conventional confrontation at all. His forward scouts had been removed by something invisible. His navigation had been compromised on the ships that took the widest positions, the ones that would have been hardest for him to observe closely, in the middle of a formation advance. And the planet they were herded toward had been chosen with the specific knowledge of his fleet's approach vector, which meant that the humans had anticipated his encirclement pattern before he had even ordered it. They had not been reacting to him. They had been guiding him, Every move he made had been anticipated, and the environment, the asteroid belt, the outer planet, the geometry of the solar system itself, had been arranged before he arrived to produce the specific outcome that had just occurred. He was not fighting a battle. He had walked into one. He gave the order to withdraw to a safe distance and hold position. His communications officer looked at him and said nothing. Dresh appreciated that. This was not the moment for commentary. The Admiral's voice came through one final time. "We have no interest in your remaining ships, Fleet Marshal. We have no interest in destroying you or your crew. You were hired to do a job by people who gave you incorrect information about what you would find here. That is not entirely your error. We recommend returning to your employers and giving them an accurate report. We suspect that will be uncomfortable for everyone involved. Safe travels." The channel closed. Dresh looked at the planet below. Still blue. Still white. Still perfectly calm. He thought about 6 campaigns, and how none of them had been anything like this, and he thought about the report he was going to have to write, and how it was going to say things that no report from a Vorkai campaign had ever said before. He thought, we were the dangerous thing in this system. That was what we thought. That was the mistake. He began the withdrawal. He did not speak for a very long time. He simply sat in his command chair and he looked at the stars, and he thought about what it meant that a world the Council had marked as not yet relevant had just done to a 70-ship fleet what nothing else in the galaxy had ever managed to do. He thought about the calm voice on the channel. He thought about the words, "We have no interest in destroying you." He had said similar things himself, in 6 campaigns, before the final phases. He had said them to species that no longer existed. He understood, sitting in the wreckage of a campaign that had lasted less than an hour, what it felt like to be on the other side of that sentence, and to believe, completely, every word of it. The journey back to Vorkai space was 4 days. Dresh spent most of it in his private quarters reviewing everything his sensors and analysts had managed to record during the engagement. He was methodical about it. He always had been. That was one of the reasons the Dominion had given him his rank. He did not let emotion interfere with analysis, and he did not let pride interfere with truth. The truth, as his analysts laid it out for him over the following 72 hours, was comprehensive and deeply unsettling. The removal of his forward scouts had been accomplished by automated weapons systems deployed throughout the inner system, not clustered near the planet, spread through the ecliptic plane at multiple distances, small enough to avoid detection by his standard sensors, precisely positioned to cover every approach vector his formation might plausibly have used. The systems were passive until activation, which was why there had been no energy signature before the strikes. They had been sitting there, waiting, probably for a very long time. How long? Dresh had asked his lead analyst. Based on the materials composition of what little debris we recovered, the oldest units may have been in position for 3 to 4 years. 3 to 4 years. His orders had not existed 3 to 4 years ago. The contract with the Council had been drafted 6 months ago. Earth had placed weapons across their inner system 3 to 4 years before anyone in the galaxy formally decided to come for them. He sat with that number for a long time. The navigation override was harder to reconstruct. His systems officers had spent 2 days analyzing what had been done to the affected ships, and had arrived at a conclusion that Dresh had made them write up 3 times to make sure he was reading it correctly. The humans had not hacked his ships in the conventional sense. They had introduced a very specific kind of signal, precisely tuned to interact with the resonance frequency of his ship's navigation processing cores, that had not overridden the navigation system so much as convinced them, briefly, that they were receiving authorized correction instructions from the fleet command system. It was not a hack. It was a lie told to a machine in a language the machine understood perfectly. The engineering required to do that was not the engineering of a pre-contact civilization. It was the engineering of a species that had, at some point, obtained detailed technical specifications for Vorkai military navigation systems, reverse-engineered the signal architecture, and built a transmission system capable of deploying it at scale. Where did they get the specifications? Dresh had asked. His analyst had looked at him with the expression of someone who has an answer they would prefer not to say out loud. We believe they obtained them through the Council's own technical library. The specifications were filed there 30 years ago, as part of a standard defense technology registry. The Council's library is theoretically secure, but theoretically may not have been accurate enough. Earth had been reading Council files for decades. They had not come to the Council. They had not announced themselves. They had quietly, patiently, over the course of years and decades, built up a picture of the galaxy they were living in and the forces that moved through it, and they had used that picture to prepare for something that the Council had only decided to do 6 months ago. Dresch wrote his report personally. He did not delegate it. He sat at his desk for 16 hours, and he wrote 12,000 words. And every one of them was accurate, and he did not soften a single conclusion, because the Dominion's military culture was built on accurate reporting above all else. You could lose a campaign. Campaigns, in theory, could be lost. What you could not do was hide the loss or misrepresent its nature, because misrepresentation produced the wrong preparation for what came next. The final paragraph of his report was the one he spent the most time on. He rewrote it 8 times. The final version read, "The engagement at Earth produced results that cannot be explained by any existing threat assessment framework. The target displayed pre-knowledge of fleet composition, tactical doctrine, and approach methodology that exceeds what should be possible, given any conventional intelligence operation. Their defensive systems were of a sophistication that suggests significant covert development over a period of years. Most significantly, their operational philosophy does not match any known pattern for defensive response to a first contact threat. They did not attempt to destroy our fleet. They herded it, reduced it, and expelled it, while maintaining communication throughout. This is consistent with a species that views the destruction of an opposing force as a secondary concern to the demonstration of capability. They wanted us to leave with an accurate understanding of what we had faced. We have complied. The Dominion should not return to this system. The Council should be informed that their intelligence on Earth was wrong, by a margin that constitutes a fundamental operational failure." He submitted the report and went to sleep. He slept better than he expected. There was something clarifying about meeting something that was genuinely better at a thing than you were. It removed the uncertainty. The 6 campaigns before this one had all carried, in some small way, the question of whether this would be the time something surprising happened. That question was now resolved, in an unexpected direction, but resolved. He knew what Earth was. He knew what it was capable of. He had lost ships and crew and the campaign, but he had gained something that was, in the accounting of a long military career, worth having. He had met something in the galaxy that he had not expected to meet. He had met something that had surprised him. He was not, he discovered, sorry that it existed. The Council chamber held 43 species, and every one of them was watching the same playback on their individual display feeds, and every one of them had gone very quiet. I was supposed to be filing a routine status report from my workstation on Sublevel 4, when the emergency convening notice came through. I was not supposed to be in the chamber at all. My rank did not authorize a floor seat. The aide who escorted me in said only that my presence had been requested by the chamber's technical review panel, who needed a witness who had been in communication with the target world. I sat in the secondary observation row, behind the primary seats, and I watched 43 of the most powerful political figures in the galaxy watch a military engagement they could not explain. The playback was Dresch's sensor footage, full resolution, time-stamped, exactly as his instruments had recorded it. The panel had been running it on loop for an hour before I arrived, and from the expressions on the faces of the Council members, or the equivalents of expressions, for the species that communicated differently, they had not finished processing it. The moment that produced the most reaction, every time the loop reached it, was not the disappearance of the scouts. It was not the navigation override. It was the moment when the human admiral's voice came through the channel after the 14 ships were lost to the gas giant's tidal forces, and she said, "We are not doing this because we enjoy it." Every time those words played, something shifted in the room. I could not have explained exactly what it was. I had thought about it during the walk to the chamber, and I still could not name it precisely. It was not fear. Most of the species in that room were too old and too powerful to feel simple fear from a military display, however unexpected. It was something more careful than fear. It was the thing that happens when an assumption you have been operating on for a long time turns out to be wrong. Not wrong in a small way that can be adjusted, but wrong at the foundation, in a way that requires rebuilding rather than correcting. The assumption had been simple. Earth was not a threat. Earth was a primitive world with early spaceflight capability and a history of internal conflict, categorized as pre-contact and assessed as not yet relevant. The assumption had produced the contract with the Vorkai, which had produced the fleet, which had produced the playback that was running on every screen in the chamber. The man who spoke first was Counselor Veth, representative of the hegemony of Rel, the oldest continuous civilization in Council records. The Rel lived for a very long time, and measured deliberateness by standards that other species found difficult to follow. When Veth spoke in a council chamber, everyone else stopped speaking. "How old," said Counselor Veth, "is the intelligence that classified Earth as pre-contact?" The silence that followed that question had a texture to it. The answer, delivered by a technical aide who clearly wished she was somewhere else, was 11 years. Veth let that number sit in the room for a moment. Then, "And in those 11 years, what has the standard observation protocol for Earth been?" The aide's voice was very careful. "Passive satellite monitoring, long-range atmospheric analysis, standard radio intercept without active decryption." "Without active decryption," Veth repeated. "Correct. Earth was transmitting encrypted military communications. We intercepted them. We filed them. We did not decrypt them." "That is correct. Because they were pre-contact, and therefore not assessed as capable of a threat level that warranted active cryptographic analysis." "Yes." Veth turned his primary visual organs toward the playback screen, where the loop had just restarted, and 17 forward scouts were once again sailing into positions they would not leave. "We classified them as incapable," he said. "They spent 11 years developing in a category we considered solved. We assumed that because they had not contacted us, they did not know about us, and because they did not know about us, they could not be preparing for us. All three of those assumptions were incorrect." Nobody argued with this. It was not the kind of statement that invited argument. I watched from my secondary row seat, and I thought about something Director Callum Hale had written in his second message to me, the one that had arrived after I sent him everything I knew about the Vorkai fleet. He had written, "We made our decisions years ago. The fleet is only finding out what those decisions were." I had not fully understood that sentence when I first read it. I understood it now. Earth had made a strategic decision, years before this fleet existed, about what to do if the galaxy came for them. They had looked at the same information the Council had about them: incomplete intelligence, old data, an assumption of primitive capability, and they had understood exactly how that information would be used, not by reasoning about the Council's intentions necessarily, by the simpler logic that any species with access to deep space eventually develops. You do not know what is out there, so you prepare for the worst of what could be out there, and you do it quietly, because announcing your preparations removes their value. The Council had never thought to ask whether Earth was doing that. They had assumed that pre-contact meant unaware. It meant nothing of the kind. It meant only that Earth had chosen not to make contact, which was a very different thing, and a much more important one. Counselor Veth asked his next question directly to me. "Ambassador Varos, you were in communication with Earth during and after the engagement." I stood, because that was protocol when addressed by a full Council member. "Yes, Counselor." "What is your assessment of their intentions toward the Council?" I had thought about how to answer this question since the emergency notice arrived, not because I was uncertain about the answer. I was very clear on the answer, but because there was a right way and a wrong way to say it, and the wrong way would produce a defensive reaction in the chamber that would not serve anyone. Their communications to me were consistently direct and consistently limited to factual information, I said. They did not threaten the Council. They did not express hostility toward Council member species. They expressed awareness of what had been decided in the executive chamber, and they acted on that awareness, but their actions were contained to their own solar system and their own defense. In the days since the engagement, they have sent no follow-up communications of a threatening nature. They are waiting. Waiting for what? For us to decide what we are going to do. Veth was quiet for a moment. Around the chamber, other counselors were murmuring to their aides, to each other, running analysis on their terminals. "There are members of this chamber," said Veth, "who are advocating for a second engagement, a more substantial force, complete resolution of the Earth situation." I kept my voice level. With respect, Counselor, I would like to know what the proposed force size is for that second engagement. Someone across the chamber, I did not catch which representative, said 300 ships. 300 ships, I said. Against a world that removed 17 scouts without energy discharge, overrode the navigation systems of 18 vessels, with a signal that our own analysts cannot fully replicate, and positioned autonomous defensive weapons across an entire solar system years before the current situation arose. 300 ships might be sufficient. It might not be. I cannot tell you that it would be sufficient, because I do not know the full extent of what Earth has built, and neither does anyone in this room. The murmuring in the chamber changed pitch. I continued, because I had said this much, and there was no value in stopping. What I do know is that Earth chose not to destroy the Vorkai fleet when they had the opportunity to do so. They reduced it, demonstrated its vulnerability, and sent it home. That is a choice. They could have done otherwise. The message in that choice is not ambiguous. They want a conversation, not a confrontation. I believe we should consider giving them one. Counselor Veth looked at me for a long moment. On what basis do you believe that? He asked. Because a species that wanted confrontation would not have sent a damaged fleet home as a message, I said. They would have sent debris. The chamber was quiet after that. The playback continued on its loop. 17 scouts. 9. 0. The gas giant. 14 ships going dark. The Admiral's voice, calm as deep water, saying words that meant exactly what they said, and nothing more. Veth turned back to the chamber. We will table the second engagement proposal, pending. We will open an analysis period of 48 hours, after which the chamber will convene again with additional information. Ambassador Veros, you will remain available for consultation. He paused. You will also answer, at that consultation, the question of how you came to be in communication with Earth in the first place. I had expected that. Of course, Counselor. The session recessed. I walked back to my workstation through corridors that were full of people moving faster than they usually did, speaking in shorter sentences, with the tight-shouldered posture of species that are recalibrating their understanding of the universe they live in. I thought about Earth below whatever sky was currently above them, patient and blue, and the people on it going about their lives, most of them with no knowledge of what had happened in the outer system, most of them unaware that the conversation that was going to change everything had already begun. I sat down at my workstation. I opened a new message to Director Callum Hale. I typed, "The Council has tabled the second engagement proposal. They are going to want to talk. I think you should be ready for that." The reply came in 11 minutes. We have been ready for a while. I sat with those words and I felt, for the second time since this had begun, the specific sensation of being several steps behind a conversation that I was supposedly helping to lead. They had been ready for a while. Of course they had. The question was not whether Earth was ready. The question was whether the Council was ready to understand what Earth actually was, not what 11-year-old intelligence said it was, not what the category, pre-contact, implied, but what it actually, demonstrably, in full view of anyone who had seen the playback, actually was. I started drafting a new report, a full one. Everything I had observed, from the moment I found the encrypted transmission, to the moment the chamber recessed. Every detail that I thought the Council needed to see clearly, without the distortions of assumption and category and comfortable certainty. It was the most important document I had ever written in my career. I knew that clearly, sitting in the half-quiet of my workstation with the station's ventilation system humming around me. I also knew something else. It was going to matter less than what Earth decided to do next. Because Earth was not waiting for my report. They were waiting for something they had already prepared for. And whatever that was, the Council was about to find out that the conversation they thought they were starting had been waiting a very long time for them to arrive at it. The 48-hour analysis period produced a document that ran to 400 pages and contained nothing I did not already know. The Council's analytical division was thorough. They were always thorough. But thoroughness applied to incomplete data only refines the edges of what you already know. The fundamental gap in the document was the same gap that had existed in every piece of intelligence the Council had on Earth. It was built on what could be observed from a distance, and Earth had spent years making sure that what could be observed from a distance was only what they chose to show. I submitted my own report alongside the analytical division's document. Mine was 22 pages. It was the 22 most carefully chosen pages I had ever written, and when I was finished with them, I sat back and read the whole thing from beginning to end, and asked myself whether every sentence in it was true, and whether every sentence that was true was one that needed to be said. The answer to both questions was yes. The council convened again at the end of the analysis period with an expanded attendance. The representatives who had been absent for the first session had returned, called back by emergency notifications that I suspected they had processed with varying degrees of alarm. The chamber was full in a way it rarely was. Full in the way that a room is full when everyone in it knows that something is about to be decided that cannot be undone. I sat in the same secondary row seat. I had the same view of the same chamber, and I watched it fill with the same political weight it always carried, and I felt the same awareness of being a junior diplomat in a room built for powers much older and larger than my own career. The session opened with the analytical division's report. The lead analyst presented for 30 minutes. She was good at her work, and she presented the data clearly, and when she was finished, the chamber was in the same position it had been in at the start, facing an enemy they could not fully measure, with weapons they could not fully understand, and a disposition that, as I had pointed out in my own report, was not obviously hostile if you read it correctly. The second engagement proposal was brought back to the floor. The vote was called. It failed. Not by a narrow margin. It failed by 28 votes to 15. The 15 who had voted for it did not argue. In a council this old, you learned when a vote was over. What happened after a failed vote was the more important thing, the discussion of what to do instead. Councillor Veth spoke again. This chamber will authorize an official communication to Earth, proposing formal first contact under the Standard Council Protocol. Ambassador Varos will serve as the primary liaison, given his existing communication history with their representatives. The communication will be open, transparent, and will include, I want to be clear about this, a full and accurate account of the Executive Chamber's prior decision regarding the Vorkai contract. The chamber went very still. Someone from the Vorkai bloc, not Dresch, who was still in transit, but his political representative on the station, said, "Counselor, that disclosure would be unprecedented." "Yes," said Veth, "it would be. And the reason it has never been done before is that it has never been necessary before. Earth is already aware of the contract. They referenced it directly in their communications. Concealing what we know they know is not diplomacy. It is theater. This chamber will not begin a formal relationship with a civilization of Earth's evident capability by performing theater." Nobody argued with Veth twice in one session. That was simply how it worked. I was called to the floor. I walked down from the secondary row to the central address position, a place I had never stood before, in 11 years, and I faced the full chamber, and I said, in the measured and deliberate style that council proceedings required, everything that needed to be said about what I had done, and why I had done it, and what Earth had shown me in the hours that followed. When I finished, Councillor Veth said only, "You acted correctly, Ambassador. The record will reflect that." I walked back to my seat. My hands were steady. My secondary vision registered heat signatures consistent with elevated emotions from about a third of the chamber. I did not look directly at any of them. I sent a message to Director Callum Hale that evening. Formal contact proposal incoming. Official. Transparent. I will be the primary liaison. His reply came in 8 minutes, which was faster than any previous reply, which told me something about how closely Earth was watching their communications in the current period. "We appreciate everything you have done, Ambassador Varos. Before the formal contact process begins, there is something we would like to show you. If you are willing to make the journey, we would like to invite you to Earth." I read that twice. Then I sent back a single word. Yes. The station around me hummed. Somewhere in the distance, a transport shuttle docked with a sound like a slow breath. The galaxy was doing what it always did, moving, spinning, existing at the scale that makes any individual moment feel very small. But some moments are not small, regardless of the scale around them. The invitation to Earth was one of those moments. I knew it with the particular certainty that comes not from analysis or calculation, but from the accumulated weight of everything you have seen in the past several days, stacked up until it is high enough to see over the horizon. Something was beginning. Not the thing I had expected to be part of. Not any of the things my training or my career or my understanding of how the galaxy worked had prepared me for. Something else entirely. And I was, against all professional caution and personal expectation, glad to be the one walking toward it. The gravity hit me first. Earth pulls harder than the council station I had called home for 11 years, and the difference is not something you adjust to intellectually. It lives in your knees, and your spine, and the specific way your body has to redistribute its weight when it realizes the floor means something different here. I had been warned about this. I had done the relevant physiology adjustments with the medical unit before departure. It still hit me. I landed at a facility that was not what I expected. I had prepared for a military installation. Given what Earth had demonstrated, a military installation felt like the obvious choice for a first official visit. What I got was something closer to an administrative campus. Low buildings, wide windows, trees that moved in a wind I could feel through my environmental suit. The sky was a shade of blue that the color specifications in my briefing files had not quite managed to capture. The man who met me at the landing platform was not a soldier. He was wearing the kind of jacket that humans wear when they are trying to communicate that they are having a casual conversation, and he was carrying something that turned out to be a warm beverage, which he offered to me with an expression I had learned to read as friendly. "Ambassador Varos," he said, "I'm Callum Hale. Welcome to Earth." I had formed a picture of Director Callum Hale from his written communications. Precise language, short sentences, a tone that conveyed information without performing emotion. Meeting him in person added layers that text had not carried. He was older than I had imagined, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long work and occasional worry, but his posture was the posture of someone comfortable with uncertainty, which is different from someone who has never been uncertain. He had the look of a person who had faced difficult things and continued anyway, not because the difficulty had resolved itself, but because continuing was what the situation required. I declined the beverage, politely, and followed him inside. "The formal contact briefing is scheduled for this afternoon," he said, walking at a pace that was easy to match. "This morning, I'd like to show you some things first, if that's agreeable." Of course. The first thing he showed me was a room. It was a long room, and the walls were covered. Not with screens or displays, with physical materials, documents and diagrams and photographs arranged in overlapping layers, connected by lines of different colors, annotated in the dense shorthand of people who had been working on a problem for a long time. The scale of it was the first thing that stopped me. I stood in the doorway and tried to read what I was seeing, and what I was seeing was, I needed a moment to understand it, a complete map of the Galactic Council's political structure. Not the public structure, the internal one, the relationships between the species in the executive chamber, the informal alliances and competing interests, the historical decisions that had created the current power balance, the financial arrangements between the Council's administrative body and various military contractors, including, I saw this clearly on one section of the wall, the Vorkai Dominion. It was the most comprehensive private intelligence document I had ever seen. In 11 years of Council work, I had access to significant classified materials. This exceeded them. "How long has this been in development?" I asked. Hale looked at the wall with the mild pride of someone who has worked on something for a long time and considers it largely complete. The current version of this room, about 6 years. The underlying files go back further. Our first clear signal that the Council existed came to us approximately 40 years ago. We spent the first decade just confirming that what we were receiving was real and not a natural phenomenon. The decade after that was mostly translation and analysis. The 20 years after that were, he gestured at the wall, this, 40 years. "You knew about the Council for 40 years, I said. "Yes. And you told no one." "We tried, twice, to send a general contact signal using mathematical sequences, the standard approach. The signals were intercepted by Council monitoring systems and filed as probable natural radio artifact. Nobody came to investigate. We interpreted that as meaning either the Council didn't want contact, or wasn't ready for it. In either case, announcing ourselves loudly seemed like a way to invite a situation we weren't prepared for. So you waited. We got ready." He walked me further into the building. We passed through a large open workspace where people were doing things I could not fully identify. Running analysis, coordinating something, working at the kind of sustained pace that suggests a situation still in active management. Nobody stopped working when I walked through, which told me something about how Earth handled unusual events. They kept doing what they were doing. The second room Hale showed me was underground. We took a lift that descended for what my internal calibration suggested was a significant distance, and when the doors opened, I was standing at the edge of a control facility that stretched further than I could see in a single view. The scale of it was remarkable. Long rows of workstations, large display surfaces showing feeds I recognized, sensor data, communication logs, the kind of positional tracking I associated with large-scale space operations. "This is our external operations center," Hale said. "We run our outer system monitoring from here, the asteroid belt installations, the deep space early warning network, the solar system perimeter systems. The systems that detected the Vorkai fleet," I said. "The outer network picked them up 11 days before the engagement. We had been tracking them since before the contract was formalized. We found the contract communication 2 days after your signal." I turned to look at him. "You found the contract communication independently?" "Yes. We had been monitoring Council communications for about 12 years at that point. Mostly routine, mostly not relevant to us. The contract notification was flagged by our analysis systems because it used the specific encrypted format the Council reserves for military operations in non-member star systems. Your signal arrived 2 days later. We appreciated it." He paused. "It mattered that you sent it." I thought about that. I thought about what it meant, that Earth had already known, and had still appreciated being told. Not because the information was new, because someone had chosen to give it anyway. "The engagement," I said. "You could have engaged earlier, before the fleet reached the inner system." "Yes. Why didn't you?" He looked at me steadily. "We needed them to see everything we wanted them to see, in the right order, so they could carry an accurate report back. A complete early engagement would have been tactically clean, but informationally incomplete. We needed their sensors recording specific things. The way it played out, Dresch's own instruments captured everything we wanted the Council to see. His report was, in a sense, our message." I stood in the middle of the operations center, and I thought about that for a long moment. They had not just won a battle, they had designed the battle to produce a specific message, delivered by an adversary's own reporting system, addressed to the audience they actually wanted to reach. Which was not Dresch, it was the Council. "You fought them," I said slowly, "to talk to us." Hale nodded once. "We needed to get your attention. We had been trying to get your attention for 40 years. The standard methods were not working." He walked me through the rest of the facility over the next 2 hours. I saw the early warning network, sensors distributed through the solar system at distances and densities that made the Council's own monitoring infrastructure look, by comparison, like something assembled from beginner components. I saw the navigation override system, which was housed in a set of transmitters that were themselves works of engineering I needed to study carefully before I fully grasped what they did. I saw the autonomous weapons deployment system, the one that had removed Dresch's scouts, and I saw the manufacturing logs that showed when the first units of that system had been placed in position. 4 years and 3 months before the Vorkai contract was signed. "You didn't know the Vorkai were coming," I said. "No, but we knew something was going to come, eventually. The probability of being left alone indefinitely was not high." He said this without particular drama. "The way you state something that has been analyzed thoroughly and arrived at a conclusion, and the conclusion has been accepted. We assessed the most probable threat parameters and built for them. The Vorkai fit the threat model well, actually. Better than the median scenario." "What was the median scenario?" "Something larger. We considered ourselves fortunate." We ate together in a small room off the main corridor, a meal that Hale's staff had prepared with awareness of my dietary requirements, which they had obtained from my species' public biological documentation, which they had been cross-referencing against their own nutritional chemistry for what appeared to be several weeks. The care that had gone into it was the kind that signals long preparation, rather than rapid adjustment. Over the meal, I asked the question that had been sitting at the back of my thinking since the operations center. "What do you want from the Council?" Hale set down the item he had been holding, which was a fork, and he looked at me with the same direct expression he had used in every conversation so far. "We want what any civilization wants, when it makes contact with a larger community, he said. Recognition, a seat at the table, the ability to participate in decisions that affect our solar system, on terms we agree to, rather than terms that are imposed on us. And in exchange? We are very good at certain things, he said. The Council's record on defense is adequate for a galaxy in which the primary conflicts are between member species operating under mutual deterrence. It is not adequate for threats that exist outside that framework. We have spent a long time studying both what the Council is good at and where its gaps are. We are willing to address those gaps. As a military partner. As a partner, he said. Military is one component. We can contribute in other ways too. But yes, we are aware that our most immediately relevant asset is that we can defend things that need defending. We would prefer to offer that capability rather than demonstrate it repeatedly. I thought about the 40 years of silence. I thought about the room with the wall. I thought about the operations center and the early warning network and the ships that had sailed into Earth's solar system and the very specific way that Earth had dealt with them. I need to be honest with you, I said. There are members of the Council who are going to be afraid of you regardless of what you offer. We know. That fear may not be rational, but it will be real. It will shape their decisions. We know that too. He picked up his fork again. We are not asking them not to be afraid. We are asking them to be afraid of us, and work with us anyway, because the alternative, being afraid of us and working against us, produces outcomes that are worse for everyone. He said it plainly, the way you state something that is true without requiring emphasis, not a threat, an analysis, a reading of the available options and a preference for the one that made most sense. I thought about Counselor Veth, old beyond my ability to fully imagine, asking careful questions in a chamber full of species who had been running the galaxy for longer than my own civilization had existed. I thought about what Veth would make of Callum Hale. I thought, not for the first time, that those two were going to have a very interesting conversation, and that whatever came out of it would be the thing that actually mattered. The formal contact session is this afternoon, I said. It is. Is there anything you want me to know before it begins? He thought about this for a moment. Only one thing, he said. Whatever happens in that session, we are not in a hurry. We have been patient for 40 years. We can be patient a little longer. Tell them that, if it helps. Tell them we are not coming to demand anything. We are coming to introduce ourselves properly, because that introduction is 37 years overdue, and we thought it was time. I looked at him across the table, in the small room, on the planet below a blue-white sky, and I thought, yes, I will tell them that. And I thought about how the Council had spent 40 years looking at Earth and seeing something manageable, something categorized, something filed and noted and not urgent, and how Earth had spent 40 years looking back and seeing something they needed to understand completely before they said a single word. I thought about who had been right, and then I finished my meal, and we walked to the formal contact session, and I began translating between two kinds of patients, one very old, and one that had decided, 40 years ago, that waiting was not the same as being passive, and had spent every year since then proving it. The formal contact session was held in a building that Earth had built for exactly this purpose. I recognized that immediately. The room was not adapted from something else. It was purpose-designed, with sight lines and acoustic properties and temperature gradients, calibrated for a multi-species meeting. The chairs were adjustable to accommodate different physical configurations. The air handling system could shift to meet different atmospheric preferences. The lighting was adjustable across a spectrum wider than human vision required, but appropriate for the range of species that might be present. They had built this room without knowing which specific species would sit in it. They had built it for all possibilities. That detail, small as it was, told me more about Earth's preparation than the operations center had. The operations center told me how they had prepared for the worst. This room told me how they had prepared for the best. Both kinds of preparation, maintained in parallel, for decades. I sat in the liaison seat, the position reserved for the intermediary, the person whose job is to help two parties understand each other. I had sat in similar seats before. This one felt different. Not because the seat was different, because the room on one side of it and the connection on the other side of it were not like anything I had facilitated before. The human delegation was small. Hale, 2 senior advisors, and a woman who was introduced as Admiral Nora Webb, the same voice that had spoken to Dresch on the command channel. She was not what I expected. Not from her voice, which had carried the calm authority of someone who has given orders that were carried out exactly as intended. In person, she was quieter, with the stillness of someone who conserves her attention for things that warrant it. She looked at me when Hale introduced us, and her assessment of me was brief and, I thought, accurate. The council delegation was remote, transmitted live, which was the arrangement we had agreed on. Several full members on screen, with Councillor Veth at the center. His expression was the thing I watched most carefully during the session. Veth had lived long enough to have seen civilizations rise and decline, and his face had learned to hold its conclusions privately until he was ready to share them. But even Veth, across a light-second transmission delay, showed something in those first minutes that I could only describe as recalibration. He was looking at the people across the table from me and seeing them for what they were, rather than what the category had told him they should be. Admiral Webb spoke for Earth. She spoke clearly, and without notes, and without apparent concern for the delay in the transmission. She stated, in sequence, what Earth knew about the Council, how long they had known it, what they had done with that knowledge, and what they were proposing now. She did not apologize for the 40 years of silence. She did not explain it as anything other than what it was, a deliberate choice made for specific reasons. We wanted to be ready, she said, ready to meet you on terms that were acceptable to us. We are ready now. We understand that this is an unusual circumstance. We understand that our first direct interaction with Council military forces was not the conventional introduction. We are sorry for any losses your contracted forces sustained. We did not pursue unnecessary harm. Councillor Veth asked, in the careful way he had, what do you want from this relationship? Hale answered. His words matched almost exactly what he had said to me over the meal, which told me that he said what he meant and meant what he said, which was, in my experience, rarer than it should be. Veth listened. The other council members on the transmission listened. I watched everyone listen, and I kept quiet, because this was the moment when my job was simply to be present and not to intervene. When Hale finished, Veth was silent for a moment that stretched long enough to include the transmission delay and then a deliberate pause beyond it. You have described yourself as capable, Veth said. Your recent demonstration confirms capability. But capability is not the same as trustworthiness. How does this chamber evaluate the latter? Webb answered this one. She leaned forward slightly. Not aggressive, just direct. You can't, she said. Not from one conversation. We understand that. We are not asking you to trust us on the basis of what we say in this room. We are asking you to structure an agreement that creates opportunities for trust to develop through demonstrated behavior over time. We are patient. We have shown that we are patient. We are willing to extend that patience into the structure of a formal relationship. There was a moment after that, another one of those moments where the room finds its weight. Councillor Veth made the decision that the council had implicitly delegated to him, as they always did when something was genuinely new. This chamber will consider a provisional engagement framework, he said. Ambassador Veros will continue as primary liaison. We will schedule a full formal session within the council in 60 days. Earth will be invited to send a permanent representative to Council Station 7. Webb nodded once. We accept, she said. The session ended. The screens went dark. Hale and Webb exchanged a look that carried something I recognized as relief. Not the relief of someone who did not expect success, but the relief of someone who had spent a long time working toward a thing, and had just seen it take its first real step. I was taken back to the landing platform as the day's light was changing, the sky moving toward the orange range that I had read about and not yet seen. I stood in it for a moment before boarding. Hale walked me out. Thank you, he said, for the warning, for everything since. I did what the situation required, I said, which was the honest answer. He nodded. He looked at the sky for a moment, the same sky his species had been looking at for 50,000 years, during all of which, apparently, they had been doing nothing so much as getting ready. We'll take care of what comes next, he said. We always have. I believed him completely. I boarded my transport. I watched Earth grow small behind me, blue and white against the dark, patient as it had always been, still giving nothing away that it had not chosen to give. I thought about what the council had done, the contract, the fleet, the assumption, and I thought about what Earth had done in return. And I thought about what the galaxy looked like now, 60 days before a formal session that was going to change every category and every calculation and every quiet certainty that the oldest civilization in recorded history had been using to read its universe. I thought, this is only the beginning. And I was right. But the beginning had already been running for 40 years, and everything that came next was only finding out how far it had gotten. The council had never had a vote like it before, and the people who had been on the council for 300 years said so repeatedly, which was how you could tell the vote had genuinely surprised them. I had been named Earth's permanent liaison, the first non-human to hold that designation, and I was sitting in the central floor of the council chamber for the first time as a full participant rather than an observer, which meant I could feel the room differently. From the secondary row, a chamber full of species is a wall of sensation, heat signatures, pheromone undertones, the specific kind of silence that happens when collective thinking is occurring. On the floor, it was all of that, and also the weight of direct attention from 43 political presences that had been making decisions about the galaxy for longer than some of those species' home stars had been burning. The formal session was 62 days after the preliminary contact. 2 days late, because the REL had requested the additional time to complete their own internal analysis, and when the REL requested something, the Council gave it. Earth's permanent representative had arrived 6 days earlier. Her name was Deputy Director Priya Nolan, and she was not a diplomat by training. She was a logistician, which was the thing about her that most confused the Council's diplomatic corps, who expected anyone sent to represent a civilization in formal negotiations to have a background in negotiation. Hale's choice, I had understood immediately. A logistician thinks about systems, about how things connect, and what they need, and what breaks if you remove one part, about the gap between what a structure is supposed to do and what it actually does. Those were exactly the skills needed for what was coming. Nolan sat at the Earth Observer's seat, temporary, pending formal member status, and she watched the chamber prepare with the expression of someone completing a very long mental checklist. I liked her immediately. The session opened with the full analytical report from the Council's review panel, presented over 90 minutes. It covered everything: the intelligence failure, the Vorkai contract, the engagement, the subsequent contact proceedings. It was careful and complete, and it included, as Councillor Veth had insisted in the preliminary sessions, the full accounting of the Executive Chamber's original decision. Not sanitized, not softened. The decision to have Earth removed, the reasoning behind it, and the assessment that the reasoning had been based on fundamentally inaccurate information. Several members of the Executive Chamber were in the room for this reading. I watched them. They sat with the particular stillness of people who have prepared themselves for a difficult experience, and are managing that experience through controlled breathing and controlled expression. I did not feel particularly sympathetic toward them. I had spent 62 days carrying the knowledge of what they had approved, and while I understood the political logic that had produced the decision, the political logic did not make it less wrong. After the report, the Vorkai representative, not Dresch, who had submitted his report and returned to operational duty, but the Dominion's political attaché, asked to address the chamber. He stood and said, with the specific tone of an entity that has done the calculation and arrived at the least damaging option, the Dominion withdraws its objection to Earth's observer status. We consider the prior engagement concluded. We do not pursue further action against Earth. We ask the Chamber to note that the Dominion acted in good faith on contractual terms, as understood at the time of agreement. He sat down. There was a beat of silence, and then Nolan, from the observer seat, said, Earth accepts the Dominion's statement at face value. We have no ongoing grievance with Vorkai forces. A small number of council members turned to look at her. She met the attention without reacting to it. Then the vote was called. The proposal was the one that Hale and Webb and Nolan had drafted with my assistance over the preceding weeks. A formal provisional partnership between Earth and the Galactic Council, with Earth recognized as an associate member pending full application review. Assigned liaison responsibilities for 3 sectors of space that the Council had historically struggled to stabilize, and granted observer rights in all chamber proceedings. It was, by any measure, a remarkable proposal. Associate member status, in Council history, had taken most civilizations between 1 and 300 years to achieve through the standard application process. Earth was asking for provisional associate status 62 days after first official contact, on the basis that the standard process was designed for civilizations that had not already been present in the galaxy's strategic picture for 40 years, without anyone noticing. The argument, which Nolan had laid out in the written submission, was simply this: Earth was not new. Earth had been here, paying attention, building capability, and operating in the same galaxy as the Council for decades. The standard process assumed a civilization that needed to learn the landscape. Earth did not need to learn the landscape. Earth had already mapped it. The provisional status was recognition of reality, not an acceleration of process. The vote was 61 in favor, 4 opposed, 3 abstaining. 61. The chamber had 412 active voting members. 61 was a supermajority under the specific subsection of the Council's charter that covered emergency provisional status designations. It passed on first vote. Councillor Veth, reading the result, paused for just long enough that you might wonder if he was surprised. Then he said, in the precise cadence of someone announcing something that will appear in records consulted for centuries, Earth is recognized as a provisional associate member of the Galactic Council. Representative Nolan, welcome to the floor. Nolan stood. She walked from the observer seat to the floor. She sat in the provisional member seat, which had been placed and labeled and ready, which told you how confident Hale and Webb and the entire Earth team had been about the vote. She sat, and she looked around the chamber with an expression that was not triumphant. It was focused. She was already thinking about the next thing. I thought, of course she is. The session continued. The 3 sectors assigned to Earth's liaison responsibility were outlined. They were sectors the Council had struggled with for years, involving disputes between member species that had resisted conventional diplomatic resolution. Giving them to Earth was either a test or an acknowledgement that Earth might actually be able to handle what others had not, possibly both. Nolan asked one question during the assignment discussion. She asked for the complete case files on all 3 sectors, including the materials that had not been shared in the general briefing, including the communications that the relevant parties had sent through unofficial channels. The panel chair said that the unofficial communications were not normally shared in this context. Nolan said, if you want the disputes resolved, we need the full picture. A pause. The panel chair said the files would be provided. After the formal session concluded, I walked with Nolan through the corridor toward the liaison offices that had been prepared for Earth's new permanent presence on the station. She was quiet for most of the walk. She was processing, I thought, running the room, the vote, the sector assignments, through whatever internal framework she used to make sense of new information. 61-4, I said. More than we expected, she said. Hale projected 53. The rel swung several votes at the end. I know. Veth's been working on this for longer than the session has. He came to his own conclusions before we finished making our case. She paused. He's been watching us for a long time. I looked at her. What do you mean? The rel observation network, she said. We traced a set of passive sensors in our outer system about 20 years ago. Not Council standard, older architecture, different design philosophy. We flagged them as rel. We monitored them but didn't disturb them. We assumed they had their own reasons for watching. And you didn't say anything. Veth knew we had found them. We ran analysis on the signal patterns from those sensors over the years and found an anomaly about 3 years ago that suggested bidirectional data. Someone had introduced a very subtle monitoring flag, and we suspected it was to see if we'd react to being watched. She stopped walking and turned to look at me directly. We left them alone. We kept our behavior consistent. We assumed that was the test. I thought about Councillor Veth and his centuries of careful observation and his 61-vote margin. He was watching to see how you behaved when you thought no one was looking, I said. Yes. And you knew he was watching. We suspected. We couldn't be certain. She started walking again. So we just behaved the way we always behave. We didn't change anything. If it was a test, we weren't going to pass it by performing. We were going to pass it or not pass it based on what we actually did. We reached the liaison offices. The door opened to a space that had been fitted out in the past week. Workstations, communication arrays, a small meeting table. Functional, simple, exactly what was needed. Nolan stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. "What are the 3 sectors actually like?" she asked. "Not the briefing version. What's the real situation?" I had spent 2 weeks reviewing the files in preparation for exactly this conversation. 2 of them are trade disputes that became territorial disputes after an economic collapse changed the relevant parties' calculations. One is a resources conflict that the Council has tried to mediate 14 times without success, because the mediation format doesn't account for the third party with a legitimate claim that neither of the primary disputants acknowledges. "The third party," she said. "A smaller civilization. Non-member. Significant resource presence in the disputed area. They have no formal standing in Council proceedings. But they have a claim. A legally valid one, under the Council's own charter framework, which the disputing parties have managed to keep out of formal proceedings for 11 years through a series of procedural arguments." She made a sound that was not quite a word, but carried the information of someone who has heard exactly the kind of thing they expected to hear. "Start with that one," she said. "It is considered the most difficult." "I know. Start with it anyway. The other 2 won't mean anything if we can't handle the third-party problem. And the third-party problem is actually simpler than it looks." "Why?" She looked at me with the directness that I had come to understand was her default state. "Because everyone in that dispute is currently operating on incorrect assumptions about what the third party will accept. The Council's mediation attempts have all been based on getting the 2 big parties to agree on something and then presenting it to the third party as the option. That's not negotiation. That's announcement. We'll do it differently." She walked into the office. I followed her. Behind us, somewhere in the chamber we had just left, 43 species were processing what had just happened. The oldest political body in the galaxy had added a new member. Provisional, yes. Associate, yes. But present, seated, and already thinking about the next thing before the vote count had fully settled. In the sectors now assigned to Earth's liaison, 3 disputes that had resisted every previous approach were about to encounter a team that had spent 40 years studying how disputes form and what they actually need to resolve, which is not always what the parties say they need, and not always what the mediators assume they need, but something more specific and more human than either. I sat down at the secondary workstation. Nolan was already reading files. Outside the station, the galaxy continued its usual motion. Stars and distances, and the long, slow business of civilizations that have been at this for a very long time. Inside the small office, a logistician, from a planet that the Council had tried to remove less than 3 months ago, was reading 11 years of failed mediation records and thinking about what everyone had missed. I watched her read and I thought, 61-4. I thought about what the next vote would look like, after the sectors were handled. I thought about how patient 40 years is. And I thought that 40 years, as it turned out, was just the beginning of what Earth was prepared to do. The first mediation session for the third-party sector dispute happened 12 days later, and it was unlike any Council mediation I had attended before. Standard Council mediation operated on a format that had been developed over centuries. The 2 primary parties sat at a central table, the mediator sat between them, and the proceedings worked through a sequence of agenda items that had been pre-negotiated by the parties' legal teams before the session even began. The structure was considered one of the Council's great achievements, a systematic way of moving disputes toward resolution, without emotional volatility, without sudden shifts in position, without the kind of chaos that complex negotiations can descend into. Nolan had reviewed the format, listened to my explanation of it, and said, "We'll keep the table. We'll change everything else." The third party, a species called the Savan, small in number, but with deep system mining infrastructure in the contested area, had been excluded from every previous session. Their claims had been processed as legal footnotes. Nolan's first act as Earth's liaison was to send the Savan a direct invitation to attend as a full participant, not an observer, a participant. The 2 primary parties, the Chalari Compact and the Movin Syndicate, both full Council members, both considerably larger than the Savan, submitted formal objections to this. Their legal teams cited 17 procedural precedents. Nolan read the objections. She sent back a 1-paragraph response that cited the Council Charter's founding principles on the recognition of resource claims, pointed to the specific article that had been procedurally blocked for 11 years, and noted that any continued procedural block could itself be submitted as a charter violation to the full council floor, where Earth now had a seat and the standing to raise it. The objections were withdrawn within a day. The Savant arrived for the mediation session looking like a species that had spent 11 years being told to wait outside a room. Nolan greeted them first. She had researched their communication conventions. They expressed respect through specific physical positioning, which I had not known before Nolan told me, and which I had not seen in any council mediation file on the dispute, and she applied them correctly. The session ran for 3 days. On the first day, Nolan did almost nothing except ask questions and listen. She did not propose anything. She did not push any position. She asked each party, all three, to explain their understanding of what the other two parties believed the core issue to be. The answers were revealing in the way that answers always are, when you ask people to describe how they are understood, rather than what they want. The Chilari thought the Moven's primary concern was transit rights. The Moven thought the Chilari's primary concern was extraction quotas. The Savan thought both large parties wanted them gone entirely. None of these beliefs were accurate. On the second day, Nolan laid this out plainly, not as an accusation, as a finding. None of you, she said, have been negotiating with each other's actual positions. You have been negotiating with what you assumed the other parties wanted. She paused. Shall we try again with the real ones? Something shifted in the room at that point. I had been in enough negotiations to recognize the shift. The moment when a room stops being a strategic space and becomes, briefly, a space where something honest is possible. On the third day, a framework emerged, not a final agreement. That would take months of follow-through and legal formalization, but a framework, one that gave the Savan formal recognition of their claim, one that addressed the Chilari's actual concern, which was stability of access rather than exclusivity. One that addressed the Moven's actual concern, which was not transit rights at all, but a pricing structure that had become economically untenable 2 years earlier, and which neither party had formally raised because neither wanted to appear financially vulnerable. The framework document was 40 pages. Nolan drafted 37 of them in the 18 hours between the end of the second day and the start of the third. When the session concluded and the parties signed the preliminary framework, the Chilari representative, who had been attending these mediation sessions for 6 years without resolution, said something to me privately, in the corridor outside the room, that I wrote down immediately because I did not want to lose the exact words. He said, "She did not ask us what we wanted. She found out what we needed. Those are different things, and it has taken 11 years for anyone to notice that they are different." I wrote that down. I thought about it for the rest of the day. I thought about how Earth had watched the Council for 40 years and built their picture of the galaxy from everything they could observe, not from what the Council said, but from what the Council did, what it struggled with, what it repeatedly failed to resolve, and how that picture had informed every decision they made, including this one, including sending a logistician who thought in systems and needs, rather than a diplomat who thought in positions and precedents. Nolan gave me the draft of the completed framework to transmit to the Council's formal proceedings office on the same evening. I looked at the document. I thought about the 11 years. I thought about 40 pages in 18 hours. The other 2 sectors, I said. Similar dynamics, she said. Different specifics. I'll need 3 weeks of file review, and then we can schedule sessions. 3 weeks. Maybe 2, if the files are well organized. I transmitted the framework document. The Council's proceedings office acknowledged receipt within the hour, which was faster than normal, which suggested someone had been watching for it. A message came back from Councillor Veth's office. 3 sentences. Framework received. Preliminary review indicates merit. Well done. 3 sentences from Veth was, I had learned, approximately equivalent to a detailed congratulatory letter from anyone else in the chamber. I showed it to Nolan. She read it. She nodded once. "Second sector files," she said, and went back to reading. I had spent 11 years on Council Station 7. I had seen many things in that time. I had seen disputes resolved and disputes collapse. I had seen civilizations come before the chamber and leave changed, or unchanged, or diminished. I had seen the Council's great machinery work, and fail, and work again in its slow, deliberate way. I had never seen anything like this. Not because the framework was perfect. It was preliminary, and months of difficulty lay ahead in formalizing it. Not because the session had been flawless. There had been difficult moments, particularly on the second day when the move-in's delegation nearly walked out over a point of process. But because a civilization that the Council had tried to remove 3 months ago was now resolving a dispute that the Council had been unable to resolve for 11 years, using skills that the Council had not known Earth possessed, applied with a patience that Earth had been cultivating for longer than the dispute itself had existed. And because Nolan was already reading the files for the next one. And because somewhere on Earth, in the operations center underground, and the room with the wall and the purpose-built contact facility, and the early warning network that reached to the edge of the solar system, people were continuing to do what they had always done, watching, thinking, preparing, building the picture that told them what the next thing was going to need. I looked at the message from Veth. I thought about the vote, 61. I thought about where that number would be in a year. And I thought that the Council's instant regret about the Vorkai contract was going to be one of the most important regrets in its history. Not because of what it had cost, but because of what it had forced into motion. The mistake had made contact inevitable. The contact had made the vote inevitable. The vote had made Nolan's presence inevitable. And Nolan's presence, reading files in a small office on a Council station, was going to make a great many other things inevitable in turn. The galaxy was not going to look the same in 10 years. I was not certain what it was going to look like, but I knew that Earth did. They had been planning for it. They were ready. The treaty arrived in the Council chamber in the same way that significant things often arrive, without announcement, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, attached to a routine transmission that almost no one opened immediately. I was in the second liaison office, reviewing the third sector's case files, when Nolan called me in from the next room, with no particular urgency in her voice. "Read this," she said, and handed me a printed document, which was an unusual choice in an environment where everything was displayed on screens. Humans print things when they want you to hold them, when they want the weight of the paper to be part of the reading. It was the treaty proposal. 43 pages, fully formatted in the precise legal style that Council documents used for binding agreements, which meant that whoever had written it had not only mastered the Council's legal framework, but had written a document that was, on its face, indistinguishable from a document produced internally by the Council's own legal division. I sat down and read it. Then I read it again. It was the most carefully constructed document I had encountered in 11 years of Council work. Not because it made large demands. It did not. It made measured, specific, reasonable requests, each of which was grounded in Council charter language, and each of which addressed a gap or inefficiency that anyone who had studied the Council carefully would have identified. And it offered, in return, a set of commitments from Earth that were similarly specific, a formal defense partnership framework, structured access to Earth's military capability for situations the Council's own forces were not equipped to handle, a technology exchange program with provisions that protected both parties, and a long-term research collaboration proposal on propulsion and sensor systems that had an annex I could tell, from reading it, had been drafted by someone with detailed knowledge of where Council science was and where it needed to go. "When was this drafted?" I asked. "The document metadata suggests active drafting over the past 6 weeks," Nolan said. "But the foundational framework, the legal language, the charter citations, the structural approach, that's been in development longer. The proposal references Council legal precedents from 8 years ago. Someone on Earth was building the architecture for this before the engagement. Before the engagement. Before the Vorkai fleet. Before the formal contact session. The battle," I said. "They went through the battle, and the contact process, and the vote, and now." "The engagement was the proof of capability," Nolan said. She sat down across from me. "The contact process was the introduction. The vote was entry into the room. This is what they actually wanted to put on the table. They have been working toward this for a very long time." I looked at the document in my hands. The weight of the paper was real. "The Council is going to have questions about the defense partnership section," I said. "The scope of it is significant. Yes. Several members will read it as Earth seeking to position itself as the Council's primary military asset, which raises sovereignty questions. Yes, they will want to know what controls exist to prevent Earth from using that partnership position to expand its own influence in ways the Council cannot check. Yes. Nolan looked at me steadily. What's your answer to that question? I thought about it for a moment. The treaty itself provides for it. The oversight structure in Section 4, Joint Operational Command, for any engagement Earth assists with, mandatory reporting, full Council review of any Earth-initiated action within Council space. They built the accountability mechanisms directly into the proposal. The controls are there. Then that's the answer. I transmitted the treaty proposal to the Council's formal proceedings office. I attached a cover note from Earth's provisional mission, which Nolan had drafted in 2 paragraphs, stating that Earth offered the proposal in good faith, welcomed discussion on any specific provisions, and was prepared to revise any section through the formal amendment process. The response from the Council's Legal Review Division came in 4 hours, which was faster than any document of that length had ever received a response in Council records. The response said only that the proposal had been received and assigned for priority analysis, and that the full chamber would be convened within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. The standard timeline for a treaty proposal of this complexity was 6 to 18 months. Within that same 4-hour window, 2 things happened that I had not expected. The first was a private message from Councillor Veth's office, addressed to me specifically, asking if I was available for an informal conversation. The second was a formal objection from the Vorkai Dominion's political attaché, submitted through official channels, contesting the validity of Earth's standing to present a treaty proposal, given that associate provisional status was still under its 12-month review period. I went to Veth first. He received me in a meeting room that had a view of the station's exterior. Stars visible through the observation port. Very quiet. The kind of room that says, "What is said here is said carefully." He was alone. "The treaty," he said, without preamble. "Yes, Counselor." "The Defense Partnership section." "Yes." "The scope of it concerns several members. Not the controls. The controls are well constructed. The concern is what happens to the Dominion's contracted relationships if Earth becomes the Council's primary defense partner. The Dominion currently holds significant revenue from those contracts. Replacing them with Earth would produce economic consequences for a full Council member. I had not considered this angle. I sat with it for a moment. Is the Vorkai objection less about Earth's standing and more about the economic impact on their contract portfolio? The legal objection may be both sincere and convenient, Veth said. Their standing objection has some technical validity. It is worth addressing directly, but the underlying concern is economic. If this is not addressed, the Dominion's opposition will be a consistent obstacle throughout the ratification process. What's the solution? Veth looked at me with the particular patience of someone who is waiting to see if you will arrive at the answer yourself. I thought for a moment. A transition provision, I said. Earth's defense partnership would scale in over time, with existing Vorkai contracts honored through their current terms before Earth's framework takes on those responsibilities, and a formal economic adjustment mechanism, Council support for the Dominion during the transition period. Bring that to Earth's mission, said Veth. If they agree to the provision, I will address the Dominion opposition privately. It will not solve it entirely, but it will reduce it to a manageable level. I went back to Nolan. She listened to the full conversation without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds exactly. I noticed because it was long enough to suggest she was doing genuine calculation, not performing consideration. Yes, she said. Add the transition provision. Hale will agree. We thought the Dominion issue might arise. It was flagged in our economic impact analysis. She paused. Tell Veth we considered a 10-year transition timeline. We'll accept 12 if the Dominion requires it. 10 years. They had already modeled it. I sent the message to Veth. He replied in 40 minutes with 3 words. 12. Agreed. Good. The formal council session convened in 2 weeks and 1 day. Every voting member attended. Standing room was visible in the secondary rows for the first time in 17 years. The proposal was presented by Nolan at the floor, read into the record by the chamber clerk, and then opened for discussion. The discussion ran for 4 sessions over 3 days. Every concern that I had anticipated was raised. The sovereignty questions, the scope of the defense partnership, the technology exchange provisions, the research collaboration terms. Nolan and I fielded each question with the files we had prepared, the economic models, the precedent documents, the revised transition provision. For the questions we had not prepared for, there were 4, all from the REL delegation, which asked things no one else had thought to ask. Nolan said clearly, "That is a good question, and I would like to transmit it to Earth for a formal response before this chamber proceeds on that point." No one objected to this. The practice of deferring to subject matter authority rather than improvising answers was recognized as competent rather than evasive. Earth's formal responses came back within hours, which meant that someone on Earth was monitoring the session in real time and had answers ready before the questions had finished being asked. On the 4th day of discussion, the vote was called. 388 in favor, 24 opposed. The treaty passed. There was a moment after the announcement, a brief one, just a few seconds, where the chamber was quiet, in a way that large rooms are quiet, when something has shifted permanently, and everyone in the room knows it. Then Nolan stood. She addressed the chamber in 31 words. "Earth thanks the Council for this partnership. We will honor every commitment in this document. We look forward to building something together that serves the whole of this community." 31 words. I had heard a great many floor speeches in 11 years of council work. I had never heard one that was that efficient. Afterward, in the corridor, I walked beside her and said, 31 words. 29 would have been too short, she said. 35 would have been one clause too many. I thought about how someone counts the words in a floor speech before giving it. Then I thought about a species that plans every detail of a thing in advance, including the length of the words used to accept the outcome of the plan. And I thought, of course they do. My message to Hale that evening was longer than usual. I told him what the vote had been. I told him what Veth had said in the private meeting. I told him that the chamber had a different feel after today, not just politically, but atmospherically, that something had moved. His reply was one paragraph. "We know you've been carrying a great deal for the past several months, Ambassador. The Council is fortunate to have you as the person who first reached out. Earth is fortunate to have you as our liaison. Thank you for everything you've done to get here. The work is just beginning, but this specific part, is done. Get some rest." I sat with that message for a long time. Then I did something I almost never did during an active assignment. I turned off my workstation. I walked to the observation deck. I stood at the port, and I looked at the stars, which were the same stars they always were. Infinite, steady, entirely indifferent to the small dramas of civilizations negotiating their place among them. I thought about the encrypted transmission I had opened in the middle of the night, months ago, when I should have been asleep. I thought about the message I had sent to a planet I had never visited, on a frequency that had never been used, certain that no useful reply would come. I thought about 3 words on a screen. We saw them. I looked at the stars. The treaty was done. Earth was in. And somewhere in that infinite dark, things that had existed in their own particular silences were going to have to reckon with the fact that the galaxy had a new member, and the new member had been watching the galaxy for 40 years, and was not, under any available evidence, going to be easy to manage, to contain, to redirect, or to ignore. The galaxy was different tonight than it had been this morning. I was the only person on the observation deck. I stood there for an hour, just looking. Some moments deserve that. The first week after the vote was the strangest week I had experienced on Council Station 7 in 11 years, and I had experienced some very strange weeks. The strangeness was not dramatic, it was quiet. It was the specific strangeness of a normal routine operating in a changed landscape. The same corridors, the same meeting rooms, the same ventilation hum and lighting cycles and food service hours. But the way people moved through those corridors had changed, in a way that was hard to articulate, and impossible to miss once you noticed it. Species that had avoided each other's sections of the station for years were passing in the main corridor and acknowledging each other. Not warmly, most of the old friction was still present, would be for a long time, but acknowledging, the way that beings acknowledge each other when they are both aware that a third party is now present and that the third party has demonstrated clearly, that it is watching and paying attention and has better information than most of the players would prefer. Earth's presence was the variable that had changed. The Council was old and deeply set in its patterns. Decades of stable power dynamics between member species produced a kind of calcified certainty about who would do what, who would align with whom, which disputes would be resolved, and which would remain in productive suspension indefinitely. Earth had entered that system with 40 years of accumulated observation and a demonstrated willingness to do things differently, and the settled patterns were shifting. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in the small, persistent way that things shift when a new force is applied consistently and does not stop. 3 days after the vote, the Move-In Syndicate, one of the parties in the second sector dispute, sent a formal request to Earth's mission, asking whether Earth would be available to assist with a preliminary conversation about their dispute with the Chilari Compact. Not a mediation session, just a preliminary conversation. Informal. Nolan said yes immediately. I asked her if we should manage the timeline, spread the work out, establish that Earth's assistance came with a process that could not be rushed. We could do that, she said, or we could solve the problem as fast as possible and demonstrate that fast is actually possible. The Council may perceive that pace as pressure. The Council can perceive it however they like. The Chilari and the Move-In have been in this dispute for 11 years. 11 years is a long time to have a problem. If we can solve it in 3 weeks instead of 3 more years, that is better for everyone, including the Council. She scheduled the preliminary conversation for the following week. I also received, in that first week, 2 communications that were significant in different ways. The first was from Fleet Marshal Dresch. It was addressed to me personally, which was unexpected. It was brief. He was returning to active duty in the Dominion's home sector. He wanted me to know, and he was clearly uncertain whether this was an appropriate communication, because the formality of his opening paragraph was overworked in a way that suggested rewriting, that he considered his engagement at Earth's solar system to be instructive, and that he bore no particular hostility toward Earth, or toward my role in the subsequent proceedings. He ended the message with a question that surprised me. He asked if Earth's defense forces would ever participate in joint training exercises with the Vorkai Dominion's fleet. Under the new treaty framework, he said, such exercises would be of significant value to the Dominion. The engagement at Earth's solar system had revealed capability gaps in Dominion tactical doctrine that conventional training had not addressed. He thought that exposure to how Earth operated might address those gaps. I forwarded the message to Nolan without comment. Her reply came back in 20 minutes. Yes, we'll want 6 months before scheduling, to establish the partnership baseline, but yes, tell him we are open to it. I sent Dresch the response. His acknowledgement came back in 2 hours, and it was 3 words. Thank you. Good. I thought about the fleet marshal who had lost 14 ships to a gas giant's gravity and written a report that ran 12,000 words of accurate, unsparing analysis. And I thought about a defense partnership between his forces and the people who had done that to him. And I thought, this is what the galaxy looks like when it decides to work instead of fight. It does not look noble. It looks like a practical calculation, that the practical gains outweigh the pride cost, which is, arguably, what practicality always looks like from a distance. The second significant communication in that first week came from Councillor Veth's office. It was an invitation to a private dinner, which Veth hosted approximately 4 times a year, for small groups he considered worth the time. I had never been invited before. Nolan had not been invited either, which I found interesting. Veth had waited for the vote to settle before making this particular conversation happen. I attended alone. The dinner was for 5 people: Veth, 2 other REL delegates, me, and a researcher from the Council's Science Division who had no obvious connection to Earth's case, and whose presence I could not immediately explain. The conversation was wide-ranging in the way that conversations with Veth always were. He covered a great deal of ground in a way that seemed casual, until you realized he had covered exactly the ground he intended to cover, in the order he intended, arriving at the point he had always been aiming for. The researcher, it turned out, had been studying the technology underlying Earth's long-range detection network, not classified research. Earth had released the general principles as part of the technology exchange provisions in the treaty. What the researcher had found was that the underlying physics of Earth's early warning system had implications that extended beyond military applications, into a range of scientific fields that the Council had been making slow progress in for decades. The detection array, the researcher said, uses a passive resonance interaction with certain properties of dark matter distribution that we have been trying to measure for 2 centuries. Earth found a way to do it. Not intentionally, I think. Their documentation suggests they built the system for a specific military purpose, and the dark matter interaction was a byproduct they noticed and learned to use. But the byproduct is, from a scientific standpoint, more significant than the primary application. He looked at me across the dinner table. They have been making discoveries as side effects of their defense work, he said. Do you know how many times in the history of science something has been discovered by accident while solving a different problem? I said I was aware that it happened. It happens, he said, when a species works at a particular intensity and scope, on problems they consider important, for a very long time. The byproducts of that work accumulate. Earth has been working intensely for a very long time. I suspect this is not the last accidental discovery we are going to find embedded in their technical documentation. Veth said nothing during this exchange. He had set it up and let it run. After the dinner, walking back through the station's corridors, I thought about what had just been communicated. Not the science, the frame around the science. Veth was already thinking about what Earth would contribute to the Council, not just in terms of defense and diplomacy, but in terms of knowledge. He was thinking ahead to the full member application, which was still months away, and he was building the case in his own mind for what that membership would actually mean. He was doing, in other words, what Veth always did, thinking several moves ahead of the current position, quietly, where no one could see the calculation. I sent a message to Hale that night. I told him about the researcher's findings. I told him what Veth had said and had not said, and what I understood from both. He replied in the morning. The reply was longer than usual, and thoughtful, and ended with a question. Ambassador, you've been doing this for a year now. What do you think? Not as a liaison, as yourself. I thought about the question for most of the day. That evening, I wrote back, I think the galaxy is going to be different because of this. Not all at once, but permanently. I think the Council has been waiting for something to change the terms of what it thought was possible, and I think Earth is that thing. And I think, for the first time in my career, I am optimistic about what comes next. He replied in 4 minutes. Good. So are we. I looked at the message, and I thought about a night many months ago, in a dimly lit communication hub, opening a transmission I should not have opened, finding something that should not have been there, making a decision that could have ended my career and did not. I thought about the words. We saw them coming 3 days ago. I thought about everything that had followed. The galaxy outside my window was the same galaxy it had always been. The same distances, the same stars, the same silence between things. But inside the silence, something had changed. Something was speaking now that had been quiet for 40 years, and the galaxy was going to have to decide what to do with that voice. I suspected it was going to discover, as the Council had discovered, that the voice was not what it expected. That it was something else entirely, patient, precise, and ready. A year after the battle, I stood on Earth for the second time, and the sky above me was the same blue-white it had been on my first visit, and it meant something different now. I had been living between 2 worlds for 12 months, Council Station 7, and a planet that the galaxy had tried to remove from its future and failed, and was now trying, with varying degrees of success, to understand. I had become something that had not existed before in Council records, a non-human permanent liaison to an Earth mission, which meant that in some small bureaucratic sense, I was as much Earth's as I was the Council's, and both parties seemed to regard this as appropriate. I had been invited to what Hale's office described as an informal review, a way of taking stock of the year, of what had been accomplished and what remained. I arrived to find that informal meant approximately 50 people in a building on Earth's coast, which I had not visited before. The building sat where the land met the ocean, and the sounds of the water came through the open windows, and the light that came with them was the particular golden kind that comes in the hours before evening. Hale was there. Nolan was there, having returned from the station for 2 weeks. Admiral Nora Webb was there. out of uniform for the first time since I had met her. She was wearing the same kind of jacket Hale favored, and she looked, in it, like someone who had been wearing the weight of command long enough that removing it for an afternoon was a practiced skill rather than an automatic comfort. And others. Engineers and analysts and people I did not know by name but recognized from the communications records. The people who had built the early warning network, who had developed the navigation countermeasure systems, who had written the treaty language, who had been, for years before anyone on Earth's surface knew any of this was happening, doing the work in the dark. I was the only non-human. I was also, I realized, the person in the room who had been most surprised by Earth, which made me unique in a different way from the others, who had known what was coming, because they had built it. Hale opened the meeting with a summary that took 30 minutes. He covered the year's events in the order they had occurred, clearly and without exaggeration, and when he was done, he opened the floor for what he called honest assessment. The first honest assessment came from a woman named Dr. Lena Porter, who ran the Early Warning Network's research division. She said, "We are behind on the next generation system. The treaty's technology exchange has given us access to Council sensor architecture, that is, in several specific ways, more sophisticated than what we have. We need 18 months to incorporate it fully. During that window, our detection capability has a gap." She said this in a room full of the people responsible for Earth's defense, without any visible concern about saying it. "What's the gap?" Webb asked. "Anything coming from the galactic core direction, approaching at angles between 32 and 41 degrees ecliptic, at speeds above 0.8 light in transit, we would get approximately 6 hours of warning instead of 11 days. Is anyone likely to come from that direction? We've identified 3 civilizations in that sector that are not currently Council members and have not yet been formally contacted. None of them are classified as threatening. The classification is based on 8-year-old Council intelligence." A brief pause. "Put 18-month correction on priority track," said Webb. "I want interim monitoring coverage within 6 weeks." "Already drafted," said Dr. Porter. "I just wanted it on record." This was what the meeting was like. The honest assessments came one after another, not complaints, not criticisms, but clear statements of what was not yet done, what had not worked as planned, what needed recalibration. The people in the room treated the gap between what they had intended and what they had achieved as information rather than failure. The information was processed and assigned and moved from the unresolved column to the in-progress column without drama. I had attended many reviews in my Council career. I had never attended one that was quite like this. After the formal part concluded, the group broke into smaller conversations. I found myself on the far side of the room from the ocean windows, standing with Webb and a man I had not spoken to before, older, with the specific kind of stillness I had come to associate with people who had done very long focused work. He was introduced to me as Dr. Owen Price, who ran the treaty's science exchange implementation. "How is the dark matter work progressing?" I asked, because it was the thing I was most curious about, and this seemed like a rare opportunity. Dr. Price's expression changed, not dramatically, but visibly, the way an expert's expression changes when they are asked about the thing they most want to talk about. "It is the most interesting thing I have worked on in 40 years, he said. "The Council's researcher. I've been working with him directly. He's been trying to measure dark matter distribution at regional scales for 2 centuries. We built a system for a completely different purpose, and we stumbled into the method. The collaboration has been extraordinary. We have preliminary results that neither side could have reached independently." "What do they show?" He looked at me with the expression of someone choosing how much to say. "The dark matter distribution in this region of the galaxy is not random. It has structure. Long filaments, concentrated nodes, a pattern that repeats at scales we are still working to measure. We don't know what it means yet. But we don't know what it means is a wonderful place to be in science. It means there is something real to discover." Webb, who had been listening, said, "How long until you have enough data to publish preliminary findings?" 4 to 6 months, maybe less, with the Council's archive access." He paused. "The Council has been collecting data on dark matter for 2,000 years. 2,000 years of archive data that we now have access to, under the exchange provisions. We are going to spend the next year running that archive through the new measurement framework. 2,000 years of data. I thought about what a civilization finds when it applies a new tool to 2,000 years of accumulated observations. I thought about Dr. Price's face when he said, "The most interesting thing I have worked on in 40 years. I thought about the side effect of a defense system that turned out to matter more than the system itself. Later in the evening, when the meeting had settled into the kind of comfortable post-work gathering that humans seem to find important for maintaining the relationships between people who do difficult things together, I found a moment with Admiral Webb. She was standing at one of the open windows, looking at the water, holding a glass of something she had not yet drunk. I stood beside her. "The year," I said. "The year," she agreed. "Was it what you expected?" She thought about this. "Not for show. Genuinely, parts of it," she said. "The council vote was what we projected. The mediation work, that went faster than we modeled. The treaty process was roughly as planned, though the Dominion objection timing was earlier than we anticipated." She paused. "Dresch's report was not what we expected." "How so?" "We expected him to minimize the engagement, to frame it as a tactical setback rather than a strategic failure. He didn't. He wrote everything accurately and submitted it without qualification." She took a drink, finally. "That told us something. The Dominion's culture, accurate reporting as a professional obligation, regardless of outcome. We had modeled the Vorkai as adversaries. The accurate model is more complicated than that." "The training exercise proposal," I said. "Yes." 6 months out," I said. I probably could have said 4. She looked at the water. "We built a picture of them from their record. Their record showed what they did, not why they did it, or how they thought about it. Meeting them, even in an adversarial context, told us something the record couldn't. You're thinking about the gap between the model and the reality." "We always think about the gap between the model and the reality. That's the work. You build the best picture you can, you act on it, and then you update." She turned to look at me. "What was the thing that surprised you most about Earth in the whole year?" I thought about it. "The museum," I said. She waited. "On my first visit, Hale took me to the History Museum, the Military History Wing. I expected it to be, I don't know what I expected, a display of weapons and battles. Instead, it was the most comprehensive record of consequences I have ever seen. Every conflict, documented not in terms of the weapons or the victories, but in terms of what it cost, what was lost, what was changed permanently by the loss." I paused. "Every other species I have worked with that has a significant military history treats that history as achievement. Earth treats its history as education." Webb was quiet for a moment. "We almost didn't survive ourselves," she said. "Several times. Very close calls." She looked at the water. "When you come that close, that many times, you stop celebrating survival and start studying why it was close. Because you need to know, for next time. Is there always a next time? In a galaxy this large, with this many things moving through it?" She almost smiled. "We assume yes." I stood beside her, and I watched the ocean move. The water was the same shade as the sky in the last of the day's light, which was an accident of atmosphere and angle that I found genuinely beautiful, which surprised me. I had not expected Earth's sky to be beautiful to non-human eyes. I thought about the year, the vote, the treaty, the sectors, 2 of which were resolved and the 3rd in final negotiation, with a timeline that was going to see all 3 completed within the next quarter. The dark matter research, the training exercise framework, the full member application that Nolan was already drafting, and that would go to the chamber in 3 months, and that I was, quietly, confident about. I thought about a night in a communication hub, long ago from the perspective of everything that had changed, and a message sent to a world I had never visited, certain no useful reply would come. I thought about what had come back. I thought about the universe being full of things we do not know about each other, things hidden by distance and assumption, and the comfortable certainty of old categories. I thought about 40 years. I thought about the particular quality of patience that is not passive, the patience that builds and watches and thinks and prepares, that treats every year of quiet as a year of compounding understanding, that does not announce itself because announcement is not the point. The point is to be ready when ready matters. A young REL delegate asked me something last week. I said, "What?" She asked me if humans had always been this way, this prepared, This specific in how they thought. What did you say? I said I didn't know. I said you would have to ask a human. Webb was quiet for a moment. We weren't always this prepared, she said. We were this way toward each other for a very long time, and most of what came from it was terrible. We got better at survival by surviving things that should have finished us. The galaxy, the council, the other species. We applied the same approach when we learned you existed. Study the threat, understand it completely, prepare for the worst of it, and wait for the right moment. The right moment for what? She looked at me, to stop being afraid of it. I stood at the window, and I thought about those words for a long time, while the sky went from gold to dark, and the ocean kept moving with the same indifferent steadiness it had always had, entirely unconcerned with the things happening above it. The year had been many things. It had been fear, at the start, the fear in the council chamber, the fear in the encrypted contract, the fear in the assumption that a world that had not yet announced itself was a problem to be solved before it could announce itself. It had been surprise. It had been adjustment. It had been, slowly and imperfectly, something else. It had been, in the end, the beginning of a conversation that should have started 40 years earlier. And what I thought, standing there, at a window on a planet that the galaxy had tried to erase and could not, was that the most significant thing about this year was not the vote, not the treaty, not the sectors, not the dark matter discovery. It was the conversation itself. The galaxy was full of civilizations. Most of them did not know each other very well. They knew each other's records, their classifications, their filed assessments. They knew the model. They did not know the reality. Earth had spent 40 years learning the reality, not the model, the actual complicated specific thing that was living inside the categories and behind the assessments and underneath the easy certainties that made the galaxy feel manageable. And now Earth was here, at the table, in the conversation, with 40 years of that learning to offer, and the patience to apply it carefully, and the capability to back the patience with something that the galaxy had learned, clearly, not to argue with. I sent one more message to Hale that night, from Earth, before I slept for the first time on his planet since my first visit. I told him what Webb had said, all of it. His reply came in the morning, when the sky was already blue, and the sounds of the ocean were coming through the window again. She's right, he wrote. We weren't always ready. We had to become ready. That's the thing about this species. We are very slow, until we aren't, and then we really aren't. I read it twice. Then I got up, and I looked at the sky, and I thought about the galaxy outside it, and I thought about everything that was still to come. The full membership, the research, the training exercises, the disputes, still waiting for someone to look at them differently. The things still unknown that Earth would eventually discover in the archive of 2,000 years of accumulated observation. I thought about a civilization that had been waiting quietly in the dark for the right moment, and what that moment had looked like when it finally arrived, and what came after it. And I thought, the galaxy thought Earth was the nightmare, but Earth was not the nightmare. Earth was the answer to one, and the answer had been building for a very long time, patient as the stars themselves, waiting for the question to finally be asked. The morning after the review meeting, I walked to the coast early, before most of the others were awake. The water was different at that hour, not the evening gold I had seen the night before, but a gray-green that shifted as the light changed, darker where the depth was, and lighter near the edges. A few birds moved along the shoreline in small groups, checking the sand for whatever they checked sand for, entirely focused on their task. I stood there for a long time. Thereni do not usually stand still without purpose. Standing still, in our culture, is something you do when you are processing something that requires the full use of your attention. I had been processing things for 12 months at the pace that the job required, always with the next task in view, always with a transmission to send, or a meeting to prepare for, or a document to review. The bird and water morning felt like the first time in a year, when there was nothing in front of the present moment, demanding to be the next thing. I used it. I thought about the species that had built the early warning network, and the treaty, and the room with the wall. And I thought about what it meant, that they had built all of those things, and had also built this coast. Not built it in the engineering sense. They had not made the water, or shaped the shoreline, but they had chosen to live beside it, They had built the buildings that faced it, and the paths that led to it, and the culture that sent people to stand at it in the morning when they were thinking about something important. The practical and the beautiful, maintained together. I had seen this everywhere on Earth, in my 2 visits. The coexistence of the functional and the something else. The people who designed weapon systems also went home to families, and grew plants on their windowsills, and sat by water in the morning, for no strategic reason. The logistician who had resolved an 11-year dispute in 3 days also spent her evenings, according to Hale, reading historical novels. The admiral, who had handled a 70-ship invasion with the tone of someone managing routine scheduling, apparently kept a collection of music that she listened to at unreasonable volume when the workday ended. I had asked Hale about this once, the apparent contradiction, as I saw it, between the high-intensity strategic thinking and the deliberate ordinariness of the rest of it. He had looked at me, as though I had said something mildly surprising. "They're not separate," he said. "The ordinary things are why the strategic things matter. You protect the coast because you want to be able to stand on it in the morning. If you forget that, you lose track of what you're protecting." I thought about that, standing on the coast in the early light. I thought about 40 years of quiet work and what had sustained it. Not the strategic logic alone, not the calculation of threat and response, but the ordinary things that made the calculation worth doing. The people the calculation was for, the morning walks and the evening music and the plants on the windowsills. The galaxy had looked at Earth and seen a military problem, a strategic calculation, a threat to be managed. It had not thought to look for the birds. I thought, that was the other part of the mistake. Not just the intelligence failure on capability, the category failure, the assumption that a species preparing for the worst must be oriented entirely toward the worst, that preparation and humanity were separate conditions, that you could be as capable as Earth had shown itself to be, and still want, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, to stand by water and watch things move. Earth was not one thing. Earth was many things, operating simultaneously, held together by the specific kind of culture that emerges from a long history of needing to hold many things together. I had been in the Council's diplomatic service for 11 years. I had been good at it, and I had believed in it, and it had given me a framework for understanding the galaxy that I had thought was sufficient. This year had taught me that my framework was a starting point. The Council's frameworks were starting points. Every framework, every category, every useful simplification that let a civilization process the enormous complexity of a galaxy full of different minds and histories and needs, every one of them was a starting point, not an answer. The answer was always more specific than the framework could hold. The answer was always in the details the framework had smoothed over. Earth's 40 years of watching had been an exercise in refusing to use the framework as a destination. They had built the picture in full detail, uncomfortable detail, detail that included everything the Council's categories had excluded, and they had used that picture to make decisions that the categories would not have produced. I was not going to become a different diplomat because of this year. I was going to become a better one. I was going to apply what I had learned, about specificity, about the gap between model and reality, about patience as a form of knowledge accumulation, to every situation that came next. And there were going to be many situations that came next. The full member application would go to the chamber in 3 months. Nolan estimated it would pass with a comparable margin to the treaty vote. I thought she was probably right, and I thought that passing it was only the beginning of what Earth's full membership would mean, the beginning of a long, complicated, occasionally difficult, and occasionally extraordinary process of a new civilization taking its place in an old community and changing what the community thought possible. The 3 sectors were nearly resolved. After them, there would be others. The Council had been managing disputes that it considered unsolvable for decades. Earth had now demonstrated, twice in 6 months, that unsolvable often meant not yet approached from the direction the actual problem is on. That demonstration was going to produce requests, more sectors, more disputes, more situations where someone was going to think, send the humans, they see things differently. The dark matter research would produce findings in 4 to 6 months. Dr. Price and his counterpart were working at a pace that both of them described as the fastest they had moved in their professional lives. which said something about what access to the right tools can do for a question that has been waiting the right tools for a very long time. What they found was going to matter to more than just physics. A better map of dark matter distribution at regional scales had implications for navigation, for communication, for the detection of things that were currently invisible. It was going to change what the galaxy could see. And the training exercises. 6 months, Webb had said. I thought about Fleet Marshal Dresch writing his 12,000-word report, accurate and unsoftened, and requesting joint exercises as a professional response to having lost a fleet engagement. I thought about what the Vorkai would learn from working beside Earth's forces, and what Earth would learn in return, and what a galaxy looked like when its two most capable military forces were not adversaries. I thought, this is what the year actually accomplished. Not any single thing. All of it together. A chain of events that started with an encrypted transmission in the middle of the night and ran through an engagement and a vote and a treaty and a series of solved disputes and a science collaboration and a training exercise request, and was still running, would keep running, because the thing that had started was not a moment but a process, and processes do not stop at the point where you can see them most clearly. They keep going. That was the thing about Earth that I kept coming back to, in that morning on the coast. Not the capability, which was real and significant, not the patience, which was extraordinary, but the continuity of it. The fact that the thing which had produced the early warning network and the treaty and the museum with the military history wing was not a response to a crisis but a characteristic, not something Earth had become under pressure, something Earth had been building since long before the Council's contract existed, long before the Vorkai fleet had a destination, long before I opened a transmission I was not supposed to open. They had been this way before we knew they were here. They would be this way after today's crises were resolved, and the next set of challenges arrived. Patience not as a tactic but as a temperament. Preparation not as a response to threat, but as a relationship with the future. A commitment to the idea that what you do now shapes what is possible later, and that the gap between now and later is time that can be used rather than endured. The morning light had moved by the time I turned from the water. The birds had gone. The color of the sky had shifted from gray to the kind of pale blue that would deepen over the course of the day. I walked back to the building. I passed a woman on the path who I did not know, who was carrying a cup of something warm and was looking at her communication device and had the expression of someone who has just read something that requires response. She glanced up as I passed, registered me. A non-human on Earth was still not common enough to be unremarkable, and said, simply and without self-consciousness, "Morning," and walked on. That was the thing. That, exactly. Morning. 2 syllables. An acknowledgement that you exist, and the day exists, and both of these are fine. I said it back, in her language, and she was already past me, reading her device, doing the next thing, part of the enormous ordinary machinery of a civilization that had spent 40 years being ready for the extraordinary, and had somehow, in the middle of all that readiness, not lost the ordinary. I thought, that is why they survived themselves. Not the weapons, not the treaties, not the 40 years of watching. The morning, the birds, the music at unreasonable volume, the coast at dawn, for no strategic reason, except that it was there, and the day was beginning. I was going to remember this year for the rest of my life. Not the vote, which would appear in records. Not the treaty, which would shape the galaxy for generations. Not the engagement, which would be studied in military academies on 100 worlds for centuries. The morning. The birds. One word from a stranger on a path, offered without weight or strategy, or any meaning beyond the simple acknowledgement that the universe was continuing, and both of us were in it. That was the thing the galaxy had tried to remove. That was the thing it had failed to remove. That was the thing, unremarkable and irreplaceable and perfectly ordinary, that had been worth 40 years of quiet preparation. I went inside. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And we were going to do it well.